Toba Supervolcano. You know how sometimes a single bad day can throw your whole life off balance? Now imagine the entire planet having the worst year in history, all at once. That's what happened about 74,000 years ago, when Mount Toba, a volcano in what is now Indonesia, decided to have the biggest temper tantrum in the last 2 million years. This wasn't your average eruption. This was an explosion so massive it left a crater 60 miles wide. A lake now sits where the top of the mountain used to be. When it blew, it launched billions of tons of ash and gas into the sky. Think about that for a second. Entire cities today weigh less than the dust that went airborne. The sky literally turned gray. The sun went dim, and for months the world lived in a kind of eerie twilight. Scientists call what happened next a volcanic winter. Temperatures dropped drastically. Crops and wild plants failed. Animals died. And humans, our distant ancestors, were suddenly living in a world where food was almost impossible to find. Some researchers believe the entire human population on Earth dropped to just a few thousand people. That's not a figure of speech. We nearly disappeared entirely. Your family tree almost got snipped right there. It's wild to think about how small we were back then. No cities, no internet, no civilization, just scattered groups of people trying to find food and shelter while the sky rained ash. And when ash covers the ground, it doesn't just look messy. It kills plants, poisons water, and makes breathing a nightmare. Imagine being one of those few humans who survived. Every sunrise would have looked pale and sickly. The air would have smelled like burnt rock. Even the weather would have felt wrong, colder, harsher. It must have been terrifying. What's even stranger is that we can still see the fingerprints of this event today. When scientists look at genetic data, they see signs that all modern humans come from a surprisingly small group of ancestors, a bottleneck moment in our species' history. It's as if nature rolled the dice and said, let's see if these fragile little primates make it through. And somehow we did. Our ancestors survived on whatever they could hunt or gather. They shared, they migrated, and they kept going until the skies finally cleared and the world warmed up again. And from those few survivors, every human alive today is descended. It's strange to think that if Toba had erupted just a little more violently, or if food had run out for just a little longer, we wouldn't even be here to tell the story. The next time you see a clear blue sky, think about that. The fact that we're all here is proof that humanity survived its closest brush with total extinction. Lake Toba's acid rain. Have you ever stepped outside after a light rain and taken a deep breath, smelling that fresh, clean air? Now picture the exact opposite, a rain that burns, kills and poisons everything it touches. That's what happened after Lake Toba's super eruption. The blast didn't just throw ash into the sky. It also filled the atmosphere with deadly sulfur gases. When those gases mixed with rain clouds, the result was something called acid rain, and it turned the world into a giant chemical wasteland. Sulfur rain is not like regular rain. Imagine droplets falling that could eat away at plants, strip nutrients from the soil, and turn lakes into toxic soup. For early humans, this wasn't just bad weather. It was a death sentence. The plants they depended on withered and died. The animals they hunted starved because there was nothing left to graze on. Even the water they drank could have turned dangerous. Every time it rained, it was like the sky was trying to finish what the eruption started. It's hard to wrap our heads around just how much this changed the planet. After Toba blew, scientists believe sulfur aerosols wrapped the Earth in a thin, reflective haze. The sun's warmth was blocked out, and the ground grew colder. Plants already stressed by lack of sunlight now had to deal with acidic rain eating away at their leaves and roots. Whole ecosystems would have collapsed almost overnight. Forests may have fallen silent. Rivers might have been littered with dead fish. The air probably smelled like rotten eggs everywhere. For the tiny population of humans alive at the time, survival must have felt impossible. Imagine going out to gather food only to find that the berries are shriveled, the roots taste bitter, and the streams are undrinkable. If you had children, what would you feed them? Every decision would have been life or death. Do you travel farther, risking dangerous territory and rival tribes? Or do you stay put and hope the rain eventually stops burning the land? What's chilling is that this wasn't a short-term disaster. Acid rain could have lasted months or even years in waves, with every storm reminding our ancestors of how fragile their place in the world was. The psychological toll must have been immense, waking up to blackened skies, breathing in sulfurous air, hearing nothing but silence where animals once called. And yet, somehow they endured. They moved to find better water sources, learned which plants could still grow in damaged soil, and passed down the knowledge needed to keep going. This disaster shaped humanity's story in ways we still carry today. We are descended from people tough enough to survive the planet itself, trying to erase them. The next time you complain about bad weather, think about this. There was a time when rain could kill you. And if our ancestors hadn't made it through, we wouldn't be here to laugh about getting caught in a storm.
Neanderthal Competition. What if I told you that, not too long ago, you might have had neighbors who weren't quite human, but almost? Big-browed, stocky, clever, and just as capable of making fire and tools as we were. These weren't aliens. They were Neanderthals, and for thousands of years we shared the earth with them. And here's the crazy part. For a while, it wasn't clear if we were going to win. Neanderthals were tough. They were built for the cold Ice Age climate, strong enough to take down mammoths with stone-tipped spears, and smart enough to make clothing and even jewelry. They weren't the dumb cavemen cartoons like to show us. In many ways, they were our equals, and maybe even better suited to survive than we were. Their bodies were more robust, their bones stronger, their senses probably sharper. So how did they vanish, leaving us as the last humans standing? The short answer? Competition. But the full story is murkier, and honestly, a little eerie. Picture Europe and parts of Asia 40,000 years ago. Wild landscapes, glaciers creeping across the land, predators everywhere. Into this dangerous world came us, Homo sapiens, fresh out of Africa, leaner, faster, and probably a little more social. Wherever we went, Neanderthals seemed to disappear not long after. Some scientists think it wasn't a violent extermination. There's no evidence of a full-scale war. Instead, it might have been slow and subtle. We may have outnumbered them, outcompeted them for food, or simply been better at trading, cooperating, and passing down knowledge. Over time, every advantage, no matter how small, added up. Eventually, they were gone, leaving behind only a few bones, stone tools, and traces of their DNA in us. That's right. Most of us today still carry tiny fragments of Neanderthal genes. In a strange twist, they're not entirely gone. Their DNA influences things like our immune systems, even how we respond to sunlight. It's like a faint echo of a rival species still living quietly inside us. But think about how close it was. If the dice of evolution had rolled a little differently, maybe we'd be the ones who vanished, and the stocky, big-browed version of humanity would be running the world right now. Maybe they'd be telling campfire stories about the strange, slender humans they once met and how we disappeared into history. Our survival wasn't guaranteed. We didn't just inherit the earth. We had to share it first and then prove we could hold on to it. And when the last Neanderthal disappeared, we became the lone survivors of a once crowded family tree. That's not just a win for us. It's a reminder that being here at all was never a sure thing.
Dryas cold snap. Ever had a cold snap ruin your plans for the weekend? Now imagine a cold snap that ruined an entire generation's plans and almost killed humanity's greatest invention, farming. About 12,800 years ago, just as the world was thawing from the last ice age and humans were getting pretty good at planting crops, the climate decided to flip the script. Temperatures suddenly plunged back to near Ice Age levels, and it stayed that way for over 1,000 years. This period is called the Younger Dryas, and it almost sent us right back to living as wandering hunters forever. Before this sudden freeze, things were looking good for early humans. In the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, small groups were experimenting with planting wild wheat and barley, figuring out how to stay in one place instead of chasing herds across the plains. This was the start of everything we now think of as civilization: villages, pottery, maybe even beer. And then, bam, the climate slammed on the brakes. We're not talking about a slight chill here. The average global temperature dropped several degrees in a very short time, like the difference between a warm spring and a freezing winter, except everywhere, all at once. Glaciers advanced again. Rivers changed course, and rain patterns shifted. For early farmers, it was catastrophic. Crops failed. The plants they relied on just wouldn't grow in the cold.
The food surplus they were counting on to settle down and build a new life disappeared. Imagine the panic. You've just figured out how to grow food in one spot. Your family's counting on this new way of living, and suddenly nothing grows. People probably had to pack up and leave their proto-farms, going back to a nomadic life, hunting and foraging to survive. The dream of civilization might have ended right there if the cold had lasted much longer. Scientists still debate what caused this sudden deep freeze. Some say a massive pulse of fresh water from melting glaciers disrupted ocean currents, shutting down the system that keeps Europe warm. Others think a comet or asteroid might have hit Earth, kicking up dust and blocking sunlight. Whatever the cause, it was a global reset button, one that nearly erased humanity's first big step toward the modern world. But here's the incredible part. People adapted. Some groups endured the cold, learned to exploit new wild plants, and kept tinkering with early farming techniques, even under harsh conditions. By the time the climate warmed up again, they were ready, and they rebuilt agriculture bigger and better than before. So, the next time you eat bread or sip a beer, thank those stubborn ancestors who refused to give up when the world tried to freeze them out. If they had decided it was too hard and stuck to hunting forever, we might never have built cities, invented writing, or gotten to where we are today.
Mount Baekdu. Ever seen a volcano so peaceful it looks like a postcard? Picture a calm blue lake, ringed by snowy peaks, perfectly still. Now imagine that same mountain exploding so violently it changes the course of history. That's Mount Baekdu, or Paektu as it's sometimes called, a sleeping giant on the border between China and North Korea. About 1,000 years ago, it erupted so fiercely that historians still call it one of the most powerful volcanic events in human history. This wasn't just a local disaster. The eruption was so huge that ash fell as far away as Japan. Imagine waking up hundreds of miles from the volcano and finding the ground covered in white ash, the sky dim, the air choking. The blast may have been 4 or 5 times bigger than Krakatoa, the eruption that famously caused blood-red sunsets worldwide in the 1800s. The sound alone must have been like the sky tearing open. Mount Baekdu's eruption sent a massive column of ash, gas, and rock high into the atmosphere. That cloud would have blocked out sunlight, causing temperatures to drop across the region. Crops failed. Harvests that entire kingdoms relied on turned to dust. For people in East Asia at the time, this wasn't just a natural disaster. It was the kind of event that made you think the gods were angry. Chronicles from Japan and China record strange weather, summer snow, and food shortages in the years that followed. Now think about what this meant for ordinary people. Imagine being a farmer who had just planted rice, only to see the sun vanish behind a gray haze for months. The air would be gritty, your throat raw from breathing in volcanic dust. Your animals might die. Your children might starve. Entire communities would have been forced to abandon their land and search for food elsewhere, setting off migrations and even wars. We sometimes forget how fragile early societies were. A single failed harvest could topple dynasties, spark rebellions, or wipe out entire villages. Mount Baekdu's eruption might have permanently altered the population of East Asia. Some scientists even think it slowed the growth of certain cultures, delaying population recovery for generations. What's even more unnerving? Baekdu is still there, still a volcano, still capable of waking up. Today, millions of people live within range of its blast zone. If it erupted with the same force again, it wouldn't just cover the region in ash. It could ground airplanes worldwide, disrupt global trade, and send shockwaves through modern civilization. So the next time you see a calm mountain lake, don't be fooled by its beauty. Somewhere deep below Mount Baekdu, magma still bubbles and waits. Humanity survived its first tantrum 1,000 years ago, but whether we'd survive the next one is a question no one wants answered.
Campi Flegrei's deadly secret. There's a city in Italy where people sip coffee at street cafes, stroll through ancient ruins, and live their lives completely unaware that they're sitting on top of a time bomb. That place is Naples, and just a few miles outside the city is one of the most dangerous volcanoes on Earth, Campi Flegrei, the Phlegreian Fields. It doesn't look like a single volcano, though. It's a giant, sprawling caldera, a massive crater left behind by ancient explosions so big they make Mount Vesuvius look like a firecracker. Campi Flegrei isn't famous like Pompeii's Vesuvius, but maybe it should be. Thousands of years ago, it erupted so violently that it may have wiped out entire populations in southern Europe. Scientists say one eruption, called the Campanian Ignimbrite Event, covered an area the size of modern friends with a blanket of ash. That ash wasn't just annoying, it was deadly. It smothered plants, poisoned animals, and made whole regions unlivable. If you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, you wouldn't just have lost your home. You might have lost the ability to breathe. Imagine what that must have been like for the humans living nearby. One moment you're cooking over a fire. The next, the ground shakes so hard it feels like the earth itself is trying to throw you off. Then comes the roar, so loud it drowns out everything, and then the sky goes black. Ash falls like snow, but this snow burns when it touches you. People would have run for their lives, but outrunning pyroclastic flows, clouds of superheated gas and rock, is almost impossible. If you were close enough to see them, you wouldn't survive. The effects didn't stop with the immediate blast. So much sulfur and ash went into the atmosphere that the climate cooled for years afterward. Europe may have faced crop failures and starvation on a massive scale. Some researchers even suggest that these eruptions pushed Neanderthals, who were already struggling, closer to extinction, leaving more room for Homo sapiens to take over the continent. In a strange way, this sleeping giant might have helped decide which branch of humanity survived. What's unsettling is that Campi Flegrei isn't dead. It still breathes, literally. The ground around Naples rises and falls over time, as if the volcano is quietly inhaling and exhaling.
Scientists watch it closely because another eruption could be catastrophic, especially now that millions of people live on top of it. A major blast today could devastate southern Italy and disrupt life across Europe, just like it did thousands of years ago. So next time you hear about Naples, think about this. The entire city is sitting inside one of the most dangerous calderas in the world. And if the sleeping giant ever wakes up again, it won't just be Italy holding its breath. The whole world will be watching.
The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. What if one night you looked up at the stars and one of them started getting bigger and brighter until it turned the night sky into day? Some scientists believe that something very much like that happened about 12,800 years ago. They think a comet or asteroid slammed into Earth or broke apart in the atmosphere and set off a chain reaction so devastating it nearly wiped out early human populations. This idea is called the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, and if it's true, it means humanity's first attempt at civilization was nearly erased in an instant. Back then, the world was just starting to warm after the last ice age. People in places like the Fertile Crescent had begun to experiment with farming. Megafauna, giant animals like mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and giant sloths still roamed the earth. And then suddenly, something terrible happened. Evidence suggests that a cosmic object, maybe a comet, exploded in the sky or struck the ice sheets in North America. The impact would have released energy equal to thousands of nuclear bombs going off at once. Scientists have found clues that something catastrophic happened. A mysterious layer of blackened soil all over the world, full of tiny glassy spherules, melted rock, and even microscopic diamonds. These are the kinds of things you'd expect to see if the planet had been hit by something incredibly hot, fast, and violent. That layer also coincides with one of the most dramatic climate reversals in history, the Younger Dryas, a 1,000-year deep freeze that suddenly halted the warming of the Earth. But the scariest part might not have been the cold. It was the fire. Researchers believe the impact or airburst caused massive wildfires that scorched entire continents. Imagine standing on a hill and seeing everything around you burning. Forests, grasslands, maybe even the horizon itself glowing orange. This would have killed plants and animals and many of the people who relied on them. Megafauna that had survived the Ice Age were pushed over the edge and went extinct. Human populations may have crashed as well, reduced to scattered survivors. For early humans, this must have felt like the end of the world. The sky would have been filled with smoke, blocking out the sun. The nights would have been eerily red. For months or even years, food would have been scarce. Hunting would have been dangerous. There were fewer animals left, and the landscape itself was charred and lifeless. It would have been a test of endurance that only the most resourceful groups could pass. Whether the Younger Dryas was caused by a comet impact or not is still debated, but the story it tells is the same. Our ancestors faced a moment when the earth itself turned hostile. The fact that we are here means they found a way to survive a world on fire, and that survival shaped the course of human history.
Flooding of the Black Sea. Have you ever watched a glass overflow in slow motion? Now scale that up to an entire sea, except it wasn't slow. It was sudden, violent, and big enough to swallow whole valleys. Around 7,500 years ago, something extraordinary happened to what is now the Black Sea. At that time, it was just a huge freshwater lake surrounded by human settlements. Then, global sea levels rose after the last ice age, and the Mediterranean came crashing in. Some scientists believe this single event drowned thousands of people, erased entire villages, and might even be the origin of the story of Noah's flood. Here's what likely happened. As the Ice Age ended, glaciers melted, and oceans all over the world began to rise. For a while, the Black Sea was cut off from the Mediterranean by a natural land bridge where the Bosporus Strait is today. But one day, the rising sea breached that barrier. Imagine a wall of water roaring through a gap and filling the Black Sea basin at incredible speed. Some estimates say water levels could have risen by several feet per day. In just months, the shoreline would have been miles farther inland than before. For the people living along the original coast, this wasn't just a bad storm they could wait out. Their farmland, homes, and sacred sites were swallowed by the sea. Imagine going to sleep with your house near the water's edge and waking up to find that the water had moved dozens of feet closer overnight, and it kept coming. Families would have been forced to pack what they could carry and flee uphill, abandoning everything. The devastation didn't end there. This massive inflow of salt water didn't just drown the land, it transformed the entire ecosystem. Freshwater plants and animals died off, fisheries collapsed, and the local food web was completely reset. For a population that relied heavily on the lake's resources, this would have been a nightmare. Famine might have followed the flood, pushing people to migrate farther and spread out across Europe and Asia. What's fascinating is how this event may have burned itself into humanity's memory. Many ancient cultures have flood myths, stories about gods punishing humans with water, about chosen survivors escaping in boats, about a world reset by a great deluge. The Black Sea flood might have been the real-life disaster that gave birth to those stories, passed down through generations until they became legend. Today, the evidence of those drowned villages is still down there, beneath hundreds of feet of water. Some archaeologists have even found traces of ancient shorelines far below the current sea level, ghostly reminders of the world that existed before the flood. It's eerie to think that if this hadn't happened, human history might have unfolded very differently. But in a way, we all carry that story because our ancestors survived it, climbed to higher ground, and started over. Mount Tambora's fury. What would you do if summer never came? Not just a late spring,
I mean a whole year where the sky stayed gloomy, crops refused to grow, and winter seemed to stretch on forever. That's exactly what happened in 1815 after Mount Tambora erupted in what is still the largest volcanic explosion in recorded history. It didn't just shake Indonesia where it sits, it changed the entire planet's weather. Mount Tambora didn't just erupt, it blew its top completely off. The explosion was heard more than 1,000 miles away. Ash shot so high into the sky that it spread across the globe, forming a blanket that dimmed sunlight for months. Imagine waking up to a sun that looked pale, like it was shining through dirty glass. The result was what we now call the year without a summer. In 1816, strange things started happening. Snow fell in June in New England. Frost came in July. Crops failed in China, Europe, and the Americas. Rivers stayed frozen longer than anyone could remember. Farmers watched in horror as their fields turned barren, and the price of grain skyrocketed. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly. Famine spread in multiple countries. In Ireland, food riots broke out. In Switzerland, desperate villagers ate cats, dogs, and even moss scraped off rocks to survive. For ordinary families, this wasn't just a bad harvest, it was a nightmare that wouldn't end. Parents watched their children starve, and there was no safety net, no international aid. Horses died, which meant farmers couldn't plow fields, which meant even less food the next year. The chain reaction was brutal. Tens of thousands of people died not from the volcano itself, but from hunger and disease in the aftermath. And it wasn't just food shortages. The psychological toll was huge. Imagine months of dark skies, failed harvests, and rumors that maybe the sun was dying. People thought it was the end of the world. Churches filled with frightened worshippers asking for answers. The gloomy atmosphere even inspired literature. Mary Shelley, stuck indoors during this dreary year, wrote Frankenstein. Lord Byron penned his apocalyptic poem, Darkness, about a sunless world. All of this because of one mountain blowing up on the other side of the planet. Tambora's eruption was a reminder that Earth's systems are all connected. One volcano can change the climate for everyone. Today, Mount Tambora is still there, quieter now, but scientists keep an eye on it. If something like that happened today, it could disrupt global food supply chains and cause a humanitarian crisis on a scale we've never seen. The year without a summer wasn't just history. It's a warning that one mountain's roar can shake the whole world.
The Thera Eruption. Every tourist who visits Santorini today falls in love with its perfect white houses and deep blue sea. But beneath that postcard beauty lies the scar of one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in human history. One that may have toppled an entire civilization and delayed the rise of European culture by centuries. About 3,600 years ago, the island we now call Santorini was mostly one big volcano. Then it erupted, and when I say erupted, I mean it tore itself apart. The explosion was so violent that half the island literally sunk into the sea, leaving behind the crescent-shaped caldera we see today. The blast would have sent tsunamis racing across the Aegean Sea, towering waves that could have smashed into nearby Crete, where the Minoan civilization was thriving. The Minoans were one of the most advanced cultures of the ancient world. They had palaces, plumbing, beautiful art, and trade networks that reached across the Mediterranean. But after Thera erupted, everything changed. Coastal cities were wiped out. Harbors were destroyed. Ash likely rained down for days, covering farmland and poisoning water supplies. Their economy, based on trade and agriculture, collapsed almost overnight. Imagine being a Minoan trader who had just set out to sea with a ship full of goods, only to see a black wall of water coming toward you, faster than you could row. Or a farmer watching ash coat the fields you tended your whole life, turning them gray and dead. For survivors, there would have been no going back to normal, not when so much of their infrastructure was gone. Some historians believe this disaster left the Minoans weakened and vulnerable. Within a century, the rising Mycenaean Greeks invaded and took over. If Thera had never erupted, the Minoans might have continued to dominate the region, shaping European history in ways we can only guess. Instead, their culture was buried, literally, under layers of ash, preserved like a time capsule. Archaeologists today still find entire streets frozen in time, as if the people had just stepped out moments before the disaster struck. The eerie part: some scholars think this event inspired legends like Atlantis, the story of a powerful, advanced civilization swallowed by the sea in a single day. Whether or not that's true, the destruction of Thera was a turning point for the ancient world. Next time you see a picture of Santorini's blue waters, think about what's under them, the remains of a cataclysm so huge it changed the course of history. It's beautiful now, but beneath that beauty is a story about how fragile even the most sophisticated societies can be when the earth decides to remind us who's really in charge.
The Bronze Age Collapse. Have you ever wondered what it would look like if the entire world just broke at the same time? Not just one country falling, but every major power collapsing like a row of dominoes. Around 1200 BCE, that's exactly what happened. The great civilizations of the Bronze Age, Egypt's New Kingdom, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, the city-states of the Levant, all came crashing down within a single century. It was as if the ancient world hit a reset button, and nobody really knows why. Before this collapse, life was surprisingly advanced. These societies had writing, trade networks that spanned continents, and armies equipped with bronze weapons. Palaces were centers of culture, storing records on clay tablets, hosting diplomats and coordinating trade of tin and copper, the essential ingredients for bronze. Then, one by one, those palaces were burned, those trade routes vanished, and those records were reduced to ash. Archaeologists still puzzle over what caused this global unraveling. Was it war? Climate change? Famine? A perfect storm of disasters? There's evidence for all of it. Skeletons show signs of violent deaths, suggesting invasions. Drought layers in soil hint at failed crops and starvation. Inscriptions talk about strange invaders from the sea, the mysterious sea peoples, raiding coastal cities. It was chaos on a scale the world hadn't seen before. Imagine being a farmer in that era. One year, you're trading grain for bronze tools with merchants from across the sea. The next, the ships stop coming. The rains don't fall. Raiders appear on the horizon. Suddenly, there's no king to protect you, no palace officials to collect taxes, no soldiers left to guard the roads. Life shrinks down to survival. Entire writing systems disappeared during this time. Linear B, the script of Mycenaean Greece, vanished for centuries until the Greeks later developed their own alphabet. Literacy rates may have dropped to nearly zero in some regions. It was a dark age in the truest sense, not because people were uncivilized, but because much of their culture was lost. And yet, humanity didn't die out. People rebuilt, slowly. New societies rose from the ruins. The Phoenicians, the Israelites, the classical era of Greeks. But the memory of that collapse haunted them. Myths of lost golden ages and punishing gods may be echoes of this catastrophe passed down over generations. What's haunting is how fast it happened. Within a century, the great powers of the ancient world were gone, leaving behind abandoned cities and broken statues. It's a reminder that even the most connected, thriving systems can unravel if enough pressure hits them all at once. So next time you look at our globalized world, remember the Bronze Age collapse. The first time humanity learned the hard way that no empire is too big to fail. The Sea Peoples. Imagine waking up one morning in a quiet coastal town, hearing the sound of the waves, and then realizing those waves are full of warships. Around 1200 BCE, that scene played out all over the Mediterranean. The attackers were a mysterious group known only as the Sea Peoples, and their raids were so devastating that they nearly erased entire cultures from history. The strange thing is, we still don't know exactly who they were. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions describe them as a coalition of seafaring tribes with strange names: Shurdan, Shakalesh, Peliset, but no one is sure where they came from. Some theories say they were displaced refugees from collapsing kingdoms. Others think they were pirates or warriors pushed into migration by famine or climate change. Whatever the reason, when they showed up, they brought destruction on a massive scale. They didn't just loot, they burned entire cities to the ground. Archaeological digs across the Mediterranean show a burn layer from this period. Ashes and collapsed walls, marking the moment when these raiders struck. Major civilizations like the Hittite Empire vanished completely. The trade networks that connected Egypt, Greece, and the Near East fell apart. It was one of the most disruptive waves of invasion the world has ever seen. For the people living then, this would have been terrifying. Imagine standing on a hilltop, watching black smoke rise from your neighbor's village. Your king sends soldiers to fight, but the invaders are everywhere. Not just one army, but a tide of warriors landing from the sea. You grab your family and flee inland, not knowing if you'll ever return. Even Egypt, the superpower of the region, barely survived. Pharaoh Ramesses III fought a massive battle against the Sea Peoples around 1177 BCE, and we have carvings of the clash on the walls of Medinet Habu Temple. They show Egyptian archers raining arrows on enemy ships while soldiers fought hand-to-hand on the shore. Ramses claimed victory, but Egypt was never the same afterward, weakened, poorer, its golden age fading. What's chilling is how close the Sea Peoples came to wiping the slate clean. If Egypt had fallen, much of the knowledge and culture that survived the Bronze Age collapse might have been lost forever. Our history books might have started centuries later with a very different story. Today, historians are still piecing together who these people were and why they struck when they did. But one thing is clear. Their raids reshaped the ancient world. They ended an era and forced humanity to start over. The next time you think about pirates, don't picture a guy with a parrot and a wooden leg. Think of the Sea Peoples, the shadowy invaders who nearly turned the entire Mediterranean into a graveyard of forgotten civilizations. The Antonine Plague. Picture Rome at its height, marble temples gleaming in the sun, bustling markets, legions marching in perfect formation. It was the superpower of the ancient world, ruling over millions. Now imagine that world brought to its knees by something too small to see. Around 165 CE, a mysterious disease swept through the Roman Empire and killed as many as 1 in 3 people. Today we call it the Antonine Plague, and it was one of the deadliest pandemics in history. The story begins with Roman soldiers returning from campaigns in the East. They brought back more than just loot. They brought back sickness. Ancient writers describe fever, sore throats, stomach pain, and a terrible rash that covered the body. Some historians believe it was smallpox. Others think it might have been measles. Whatever it was, it spread like wildfire through crowded cities and army camps. Rome was a world built on movement. Merchants, messengers, and legions traveled constantly, which meant the disease traveled too. No city was safe. Imagine living in a packed Roman apartment building, an insula, with no idea why your neighbors were suddenly coughing, collapsing, and dying. No doctors could stop it. No temples could pray it away. Families would have been forced to watch loved ones suffer, powerless to help. The death toll was staggering. In some areas, whole villages were abandoned. Crops rotted in the fields because there was no one left to harvest them. The Roman army, the pride of the empire, was gutted. Too many soldiers were sick or dead to defend the borders. Barbarian tribes took advantage of the chaos and began raiding Roman territory. The economy faltered. Food prices soared. Even the emperor couldn't escape it. Marcus Aurelius, known as the Philosopher King, is believed to have died from the plague in 180 CE. His death marked the end of what historians call the Pax Romana, the long period of Roman peace and prosperity. Afterward, the empire entered a slow decline. constantly fighting off invasions and internal crises. For ordinary Romans, the psychological impact must have been devastating. Imagine watching the empire you thought was eternal suddenly crumble around you, not because of a foreign army, but because of something invisible. People likely turned to superstition, desperate for answers. Temples would have been packed with offerings. Rumors probably spread that the gods were angry or that the end of the world was near. What's haunting is how history might have changed if the Antonine Plague hadn't happened. Rome might have stayed strong for centuries longer. Instead, this pandemic weakened the foundation of the empire, leaving it vulnerable to future disasters. Next time you hear about pandemics changing history, remember that one plague helped bring down the greatest empire of the ancient world, and that we're still just as vulnerable when nature decides to remind us who's boss. Imagine being the ruler of one of the most powerful empires in history. You've reclaimed lost territory. Your capital gleams with wealth, and you're dreaming of uniting the entire Roman world again. And then, just as everything is going right, death comes knocking. Not at your borders, but in every street, every house, every breath of air. That's what happened to Emperor Justinian in 541 CE, when the first pandemic of bubonic plague swept through his empire and killed tens of millions. This was no ordinary disease outbreak. It struck the Byzantine Empire like lightning. It started, historians think, in East Africa and traveled up through trade routes carried by rats and their fleas on grain ships. When the ships docked in Constantinople, the disease exploded. Within days, people were dying by the thousands. Contemporary accounts described corpses piled in the streets, entire households wiped out overnight, and so many dead that burial grounds overflowed. The symptoms were horrifying. Victims developed sudden fevers and painful swellings called buboes, black lumps in the armpits and groin, before dying in agony. Some historians believed that at the peak of the outbreak, up to 10,000 people were dying per day in Constantinople alone. The smell of death filled the air. The empire's leaders had to dig mass graves and even throw bodies into the sea just to keep up. For ordinary people, this must have felt like the end of the world. Imagine walking through the capital and hearing nothing but the wails of mourners and the creak of funeral carts. Businesses closed. Farms went untended. The army weakened as soldiers died, leaving borders undefended. Trade slowed to a trickle. The great machine of the empire ground to a halt. Even Justinian himself caught the plague and somehow survived. But the empire was never quite the same. The population loss was catastrophic. Some scholars estimate that as much as 40% of the empire's people died. Entire villages vanished from the map. The tax base collapsed, and with it, the grand plans to restore the Roman Empire. The Byzantines would go on fighting wars, but their golden age was gone. And this wasn't just a one-time disaster. The plague kept coming back in waves for 2 centuries. Generations grew up under the shadow of a disease that could return at any time. It reshaped Europe and the Mediterranean, weakening empires, and possibly paving the way for the rise of Islam and the eventual shift of power away from Constantinople. If you've ever wondered how close humanity came to a total collapse before the Black Death of the Middle Ages, the plague of Justinian is the answer. It was a grim rehearsal for future pandemics and a reminder that the tiniest creatures on Earth can bring even the mightiest empires to their knees.
Mayan Megadrought. What happens when the sky just stops raining? Not for a season, not for a year, but for decades. That's what happened to the Maya civilization more than 1,000 years ago, and it nearly wiped them off the map. This was no small hiccup in the weather. It was a mega-drought, a century-long disaster that turned one of the most advanced cultures in the Americas into a ghost of its former self. At their peak, the Maya were incredible city builders. They had massive pyramids, complex calendars, and a thriving network of trade routes stretching across Mesoamerica. Their cities were full of markets, nobles, astronomers, and priests watching the stars. Then, starting around the 800 CE, the rain began to fail. For a society that depended on seasonal rainfall to grow corn, their staple crop, this was catastrophic. Imagine living in one of those great cities as the drought dragged on. Reservoirs ran dry, crops shriveled in the fields, hunger set in, and people began abandoning their homes to search for food. When you rely on rain for survival, every cloudless sky is a reminder of doom. Parents must have watched their children grow thin, wondering if the gods had cursed them. Scientists studying lake sediments and cave formations have found evidence that rainfall dropped by up to 70% during this period. That's not just a bad year, that's climate collapse. As the drought worsened, cities that had stood for centuries were suddenly abandoned. Once bustling plazas turned silent. Pyramids stood overgrown by jungle. Trade routes disappeared. It wasn't just the weather. The drought likely triggered wars between city-states competing for scarce resources. Political systems broke down, and kings lost legitimacy when they couldn't summon rain through rituals. The Maya didn't disappear entirely. Their descendants still live in the region today, but their great cities were left to crumble, leaving behind only stone monuments carved with warnings we're still deciphering. What's haunting about this story is how similar it feels to our own time. The Maya were deeply connected to their environment, and when that environment shifted, their entire world collapsed. They didn't have the technology to dig deep wells, transport water over great distances, or store enough to last through years of drought. They were at the mercy of the sky. When you visit the ruins of cities like Tikal or Copan today, it's eerie to imagine them full of life. Markets loud with shouting vendors, smoke from cooking fires rising into the air, and then to picture it all gone, just silence and vines reclaiming the stone. The Maya megadrought is a reminder that even the mightiest civilizations can be brought down by something as simple as the weather refusing to cooperate. It's a story about resilience and about what happens when nature stops giving.
Collapse of Cahokia. Picture this. Long before skyscrapers and highways, before Europeans ever set foot in North America, there was a city bigger than London sitting right near today's St. Louis.
It had towering earth mounds, busy plazas, and tens of thousands of people living, farming, and trading. And then it all just stopped. This place was called Cahokia, and around 700 years ago, its population mysteriously collapsed, leaving behind empty mounds and a puzzle that archaeologists are still trying to solve. Cahokia was no small village. At its peak, it was the largest city north of Mexico, home to as many as 20,000 people. Its centerpiece was Monk's Mound, a massive earth platform bigger than the Great Pyramid of Giza's base. Surrounding it were ceremonial plazas, neighborhoods, and fields where people grew corn to feed the entire city. There were markets, artisans making tools and ornaments, and rulers who likely held huge ceremonies to keep the social order running. Then, sometime around the 1300s, Cahokia started to unravel. The population began to thin out. Houses were abandoned. The great plazas grew quiet. Within a century, the city was almost entirely empty. No armies stormed the walls. No invaders burned it down. Cahokia simply faded away. And historians are still debating why. One theory is that Cahokia's own success doomed it. With so many people in one place, they may have overworked the land, cutting down forests and depleting the soil. Flooding from the nearby Mississippi River may have gotten worse as the environment was stripped bare. Farming yields dropped, leading to food shortages. And when food runs short in a big city, tensions rise. Evidence suggests there was internal conflict, maybe even violence, as people fought over what little remained. Disease might have played a role too. Living in close quarters without modern sanitation could have allowed epidemics to spread quickly. Some researchers also point to climate change, a period called the Little Ice Age, that made weather less predictable and growing seasons shorter. Imagine being one of Cahokia's last residents. You walk through once crowded plazas that now stand empty, weeds pushing through the packed earth. You see the great mound still standing tall, but no one gathers there anymore for ceremonies. Friends and neighbors pack up and leave, heading west or south in search of a better life. Slowly, the city that once pulsed with life becomes silent. Today, Cahokia is a state historic site, and the mounds still rise quietly from the grass, reminders of the great civilization that built them. Standing there, it's hard not to wonder what the last days felt like for its people, and whether our own cities could one day face the same fate. China's sorrow. Rivers are supposed to give life, water for crops, fish to eat, trade routes for growing cities. But in northern China, one river has been as deadly as it has been generous. The Yellow River, often called China's sorrow, has been flooding for thousands of years, sometimes so catastrophically that it killed millions and reshaped the entire landscape and the course of Chinese history along with it. The Yellow River gets its name from the fine yellow silt it carries, called Lewis. That silt makes the surrounding land incredibly fertile, which is why some of the earliest Chinese civilizations sprang up along its banks. But that same silt also clogs the river, raising its bed higher and higher until the water is practically perched above the surrounding plains. When the river inevitably breaks its banks, the floodwater comes crashing down with unstoppable force. Some of the floods were so massive they permanently changed where the river flowed. In some cases, it shifted course by hundreds of miles, drowning towns that had once been safe and leaving others suddenly stranded far from water. Imagine waking up one morning to find the river, the center of your community's life, had simply moved somewhere else, leaving devastation behind. The human cost was staggering. Historical records describe floods that drowned entire villages in minutes, carrying away people, animals, and houses. The death toll from some floods reached into the millions. And it didn't just kill directly. It triggered famine, as fields were buried under thick mud and outbreaks of disease from all the standing water. For the emperors who ruled China, the Yellow River was both a blessing and a nightmare. Dynasties were judged by how well they controlled it. If you could keep the river tamed with dikes and canals, you were seen as having the mandate of heaven. But when those flood defenses failed, and they often did, rebellions and uprisings would follow, blaming the emperor for losing heaven's favor. In some cases, major floods have been linked to the fall of entire dynasties. For the farmers who lived along its banks, the fear must have been constant. Every heavy rain upstream could spell disaster downstream. You could plant your crops, tend them for months, and lose everything in a single night when the dikes broke. Generations of families lived with the knowledge that the river that fed them could also be their executioner. Even in modern times, the Yellow River has unleashed tragedy. As recently as the 20th century, massive floods killed millions. Engineers have built huge dams and levees to try to control it, but China's sorrow still has the power to remind everyone who's really in charge. Standing by its banks today, you might see a calm, muddy current drifting by. But beneath that calm surface lies a history of destruction that shaped one of the oldest civilizations and nearly ended it more than once. Akkadian Empire dust storms. Close your eyes and imagine standing in the middle of the Fertile Crescent, the birthplace of civilization, around 4,200 years ago. The fields are golden, the rivers run full, and the great Akkadian Empire stretches farther than any before it. Life is good. Then one year the rains don't come, and the next year they don't come again. The wind picks up, carrying not rain, but dust. Soon the sky is a permanent haze, the rivers shrink, and the land begins to die. That's exactly what happened, and it starved an empire out of existence. The Akkadian Empire was the first true empire in human history, uniting much of Mesopotamia under one rule. They had armies, monumental architecture, writing, and a booming trade network. But their success depended entirely on the rivers and rains. Crops were everything, the foundation of their power. And then came what scientists now call the 4.2 kiloyear event, an abrupt climate shift that brought centuries of drought. Lake sediments and soil samples tell the story. Rainfall dropped dramatically, and the region experienced massive dust storms. Imagine walls of dust sweeping across the plains, burying fields, clogging irrigation canals, and choking the air. Farmers couldn't grow enough food to feed themselves, much less the cities that relied on them. Grain prices skyrocketed. Famine spread. For ordinary Akkadians, this must have been a nightmare. You plant seeds and watch nothing grow. You walk for hours just to find water that hasn't dried up. Your children cry from hunger. The government may demand taxes or grain quotas you simply cannot meet, and if you refuse, soldiers come to enforce the law. The empire's population began to scatter, abandoning once thriving cities in search of places where rain still fell. As the famine worsened, social order broke down. Written tablets from the time speak of cannibalism, of people selling their children just to survive, of fields turning to dust and cities falling silent. The empire, which had seemed so permanent, collapsed in just a few generations. Its capital was abandoned, and power shifted back to smaller city-states that could adapt better to the new reality. What's chilling about this story is that it wasn't war that ended the Akkadian Empire. It was the weather. No invading army had to cross the borders. The climate itself became the enemy, and there was no way to fight back. Standing in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia today, it's hard to imagine these once bustling cities slowly emptying out under a sky filled with dust. The fall of Akkad is a sobering reminder that civilization is only as strong as the climate that sustains it, and that even the mightiest empire can be brought to its knees when the wind turns against it. Easter Island Collapse. What if one day you woke up and realized the last tree on your island was gone? No wood for boats, no shade for crops, no way to leave. That's not a hypothetical. That's exactly what happened on Easter Island, one of the most remote places on Earth. Its famous giant stone heads, the moai, still stare out at the sea like silent witnesses to the civilization that carved them and to the tragedy that almost ended them. Hundreds of years ago, Easter Island was lush. It had palm forests, birds, and plenty of resources for the Polynesians who settled there. These early inhabitants were skilled navigators, farmers, and builders. They erected the massive moai statues as part of their culture, honoring ancestors and leaders. But carving and transporting those statues required wood, lots of it. Over time, tree after tree was cut down, not just for statues, but for canoes, houses, and firewood. Eventually, the island was stripped bare. No more large trees to build fishing boats. No more shade to protect fragile crops. Without trees, the soil eroded, making farming even harder. The birds that once lived in the forests disappeared. With no boats, deep-sea fishing declined. Food became scarce. Imagine being one of the last generations to live through this collapse. You would have heard stories from your grandparents about when the island was green and full of life, but all you'd know is bare hills and empty shores. Hunger would be constant. Rival clans began fighting over what little resources were left. There's evidence of warfare, toppled statues, and even cannibalism in the final years before European contact. Society didn't just shrink, it fractured. For a long time, people assumed Easter Island's collapse was inevitable, a cautionary tale about ecological suicide. But newer research shows the story might be more complicated. Some evidence suggests the islanders adapted for a time, finding clever ways to grow crops in stone gardens that trapped moisture. Their real population decline may have been accelerated by something they couldn't control: diseases brought by European explorers and slave raids in the 1800s. Still, the deforestation was real, and it shows just how vulnerable isolated societies can be when they overshoot their environment's limits. Easter Island became a warning, a symbol of what happens when consumption outpaces renewal. Standing on the island today, looking at the Moai, it's haunting to think of the people who once lived there, proud builders who could move statues weighing tons without modern machinery, yet who watched their last tree fall, knowing they'd never see the island green again. Easter Island's story is more than just a collapse. It's a reminder that no matter how skilled or resourceful a society is, it still has to live within the limits of its land, or risk watching everything it built crumble into silence. Gokstad Event. Vikings are remembered as fierce raiders, unstoppable sailors who braved icy seas to plunder and explore. But what happens when even the Vikings can't fight the weather? Around the 6th century CE, something happened that nearly wiped out populations in Scandinavia. A series of volcanic eruptions, what scientists sometimes call the Gokstad Event, filled the sky with ash, triggered volcanic winters, and may have left the Norse ancestors of the Vikings starving and desperate. It started somewhere far away, possibly in Iceland, or even as far as Central America or Indonesia, with a massive volcanic eruption. The blast sent dust and sulfur particles high into the stratosphere, where they spread around the globe. Within months, the world's skies dimmed. Historical sources talk about summers without warmth, a sun that looked pale or bluish, and harvests that failed year after year. In Scandinavia, this was devastating. These were already harsh lands, where farming was difficult in the best of times. When the growing season shrank to almost nothing, crops simply couldn't ripen. Archaeological studies show a dramatic population crash during this period. Whole farms were abandoned, and burial sites suddenly filled with the remains of malnourished people. Imagine being a farmer in Norway or Sweden at the time. You've saved grain from the last harvest, planted it carefully, prayed to the gods for good weather, and nothing grows. The nights are colder. Snow comes earlier. The sun feels weak, as if it can't break through the haze. Your livestock die first, then your neighbors leave or starve. What do? pack up and wander, hoping to find food somewhere else, or stay put and risk dying where you stand? For those who survived, this long stretch of misery may have changed their entire culture. Some researchers believe these hard years set the stage for the later Viking expansion. When the climate finally warmed again, populations rebounded, and perhaps a generation hardened by starvation and survival took to the seas, looking for better lands and richer harvests elsewhere. The Gokstad burial itself, a famous Viking ship grave found in Norway, is sometimes seen as a symbol of this era. It dates from centuries later, but the ship was buried with a man of power, possibly a chieftain, whose people may have descended from those who survived the volcanic winters. The memory of that time would have lingered in sagas and oral tradition, a warning of what happens when the world goes dark. What's eerie is that this was just one eruption, or perhaps a series of them, reminding us that the climate can change overnight. If the Vikings' ancestors could be nearly starved into extinction by a few bad years of sun, it's a stark reminder that even the toughest societies are at the mercy of the sky.
Black Death. Imagine walking through a bustling medieval town, merchants selling bread, children playing in the streets, and then noticing the silence. Doors are boarded up, bells toll constantly, carts roll by carrying the dead. Between 1347 and 1351, this was reality across Europe. The Black Death, likely caused by the bubonic plague, killed so many people that whole towns were left empty, and Europe's population was cut nearly in half. The plague probably started in Central Asia and traveled along the Silk Road, hitching a ride with traders and armies. When it reached Europe, it exploded. Fleas carrying the plague bacteria spread it from rats to humans, and from there it spread like wildfire. Victims developed fevers, painful swellings called buboes, and dark blotches on their skin. Death could come in just a few days. For people living through it, this must have felt like the apocalypse. Imagine hearing that entire villages nearby had vanished. Priests were too afraid to give last rites. Doctors wore strange beaked masks stuffed with herbs, hoping to filter out the bad air they thought caused the disease. Many just fled, abandoning their homes and families to escape infection, though it rarely worked. The numbers are staggering. Some regions lost 60 to 70% of their population. Crops rotted in the fields because there was no one left to harvest them. Cities were littered with mass graves. In some places, there were so many dead that bodies were thrown into pits and covered with lime to stop the smell. And the psychological impact was just as devastating. People believed it was God's punishment, and panic set in. Some turned to extreme religious movements, whipping themselves in public to beg forgiveness. Others partied recklessly, thinking the world was ending. Social order began to break down. When death is everywhere, the rules that hold society together start to feel meaningless. But strangely, the Black Death didn't just destroy, it transformed Europe. With so many people gone, labor became scarce, giving surviving peasants more bargaining power. Wages rose, feudalism began to crack, and society slowly shifted toward the modern world. The Renaissance may have been born, in part, from this grim reset. Even today, scientists find traces of the Black Death's impact in our DNA. Some genetic changes that helped people survive are still with us.
shaping how our immune systems work. It's eerie to think that a tiny bacterium reshaped human history so completely. The Black Death was one of humanity's closest brushes with extinction, and it's a reminder that the smallest organisms on Earth can bring entire civilizations to their knees.
Cocoliztli Epidemics. Picture the Americas in the 1500s. Vibrant cities like Tenochtitlan, bustling with trade, floating gardens and colorful markets. Then, within just a few decades of European contact, those cities were nearly empty. We often talk about smallpox as the killer that devastated indigenous populations. But there was another, lesser-known nightmare, Cocoliztli, a mysterious series of epidemics that swept through Mexico and Central America, killing millions more. The word Cocoliztli means pest or plague in Nahuatl, but what it really was is still debated. Whatever it was terrifying. Eyewitnesses described victims suffering from high fevers, severe headaches, and bleeding from the nose and mouth. Some developed blackened tongues and turned yellow before dying within days. In some towns, the disease wiped out entire families so quickly that there was no one left to bury the dead. Between 1545 and 1576, these epidemics struck with brutal force, killing up to 80% of the indigenous population in some regions. That's not a typo. 8 out of every 10 people gone. Historians estimate that as many as 15 million people may have died across Mexico alone. Imagine what that would have felt like to survivors. Your neighbors fall sick one after another. Priests and healers can't explain it, let alone stop it. People flee villages hoping to escape the plague, but the sickness follows them. Fields go untended. Cities grow silent, and the social fabric tears apart. Modern scientists have tried to solve the mystery of what Cocoliztli actually was. Recent studies suggest it may have been a type of hemorrhagic fever, something like Ebola, spread by rodents whose populations exploded after Spanish colonization disrupted the ecosystem. Others think climate shifts caused by a massive drought made it easier for disease to spread. What makes Cocoliztli especially haunting is that it didn't just kill, it finished what smallpox had started. Indigenous societies were already weakened by conquest and war and forced labor. Cocoliztli struck the survivors and wiped out much of the remaining population, making resistance to colonial rule nearly impossible. This cleared the way for European powers to take over vast territories with little opposition. Standing in the ruins of old temples and cities today, it's hard to not imagine how quickly those places emptied. What had been full of laughter and music and market noise became quiet except for the cries of the sick. Cocoliztli may not be as famous as the Plague Death, but for the people who lived through it, it was just as apocalyptic. A disaster so massive that it reshaped the population of an entire continent. It's one of history's great medical mysteries, and it shows how sometimes the deadliest killer isn't the one everyone talks about.
1918 Spanish flu. Train stations that were normally noisy suddenly felt empty. Church bells rang so often that people began to dread the sound. Across the world, in city after city, life seemed to pause as an invisible enemy spread faster than anyone could understand. This was 1918, and the Spanish flu had arrived. The pandemic began quietly, likely in rural Kansas, with soldiers in crowded camps falling sick. At first, it looked like any other seasonal flu. Then something changed. The virus mutated into a killer that spread with terrifying speed. Soldiers carried it with them across oceans, onto troop trains, and into cities already exhausted by World War I. What made this flu so terrifying wasn't just how many it infected, an estimated 500 million people, or 1/3 of the planet, but who it killed. Unlike most flus, which mostly claim the very young or very old, this one went after healthy young adults, the workers, the parents, the soldiers. Hospitals overflowed, entire wards filled with blue-lipped patients gasping for breath. Doctors at the time described horrifying scenes. Patients coughing up blood, bodies turning black from oxygen loss, people collapsing in the street on their way to work and never getting up again. In some cities, the death toll was so high that horse-drawn carts went door to door collecting corpses because there weren't enough coffins to go around. And yet, governments didn't want to talk about it. The world was still at war, and leaders worried the truth would crush morale. Newspapers were censored. Public health warnings were soft-pedaled. That's why the pandemic earned the name Spanish flu. Spain, which wasn't at war, reported honestly about the outbreak, so it looked like Spain was hit worse than anyone else. When the flu came in waves, each was deadlier than the last. The second wave, in late 1918, was especially brutal. Some towns lost entire families. Cities banned public gatherings, closed schools and theaters, and even outlawed spitting in public in a desperate attempt to stop the spread. People wore cloth masks, stayed home, and prayed they wouldn't hear another funeral bell. By the time the pandemic finally faded in 1920, as many as 50 million people had died, more than twice the number killed in World War I. It left entire communities gutted. Children were orphaned. Businesses collapsed. And yet, most countries just wanted to move on and forget it ever happened. But the Spanish flu changed the world quietly. It pushed governments to take public health seriously, led to better disease tracking, and inspired decades of research into vaccines. And it left behind a haunting lesson. A single virus can do more damage than the biggest war, and it can do it faster than anyone thinks possible.
Smallpox in the Americas. A clay pot sits abandoned in the middle of a village plaza, its contents rotting under the sun. No one is left to claim it. This is what smallpox left behind when it swept through the Americas. Silence, emptiness, and entire communities erased in just a few weeks.
When Europeans arrived in the late 1400s and early 1500s, they didn't just bring ships, steel, and guns. They brought something no one could see, a virus that had already ravaged Europe for centuries. Smallpox was a familiar, though terrifying disease to them, but to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, it was something entirely new. They had no immunity, no medicine to treat it, and no idea how to fight it. The disease struck with horrifying speed. People developed high fevers, chills, and a rash that turned into painful pustules covering their bodies. Survivors were left scarred, but most didn't survive at all. Entire families died within days of each other. In some regions, up to 90% of the population was wiped out. And the virus didn't wait for colonizers to spread it. It traveled ahead of them, carried by traders and refugees, infecting cities and villages before European soldiers ever arrived. When the Spanish marched into the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, they found a city already in crisis. Warriors, priests, and even the emperor had been struck down by smallpox. The once mighty Aztec Empire was so weakened that it fell soon after. The same pattern repeated across the continent. In the Andes, smallpox killed the Inca ruler and his heir, throwing the empire into a civil war that made it easier for Francisco Pizarro to conquer them. It wasn't just a disease. It was a weapon no one intended to use, but one that cleared the land before colonization could even begin. For those who lived through it, life became unrecognizable. Fields went untended, cities emptied, and knowledge passed down for generations was lost when entire communities disappeared. Some villages were completely abandoned and never reoccupied. Smallpox didn't just kill individuals. It killed languages, songs, rituals, and stories. It killed resistance, clearing the way for colonization in a way no European army could have accomplished alone. By the time some colonists reached new territories, they were stepping into places already silent, as if the land itself had surrendered. It would take centuries for humanity to finally defeat smallpox. In 1980, thanks to global vaccination efforts, the disease was officially declared eradicated, the only human disease we've ever completely wiped off the planet. But that victory came too late for the millions in the Americas whose lives, families, and cultures were taken centuries earlier. The moai of Easter Island may stare silently at the sea, but the abandoned plazas of the Americas speak just as loudly, reminders of a time when death came not with swords, but with something far smaller and far deadlier.
HIV's early spread. By the mid-1980s, more than 1 in every 100 men in some major cities was infected with a mysterious, deadly new disease, and doctors had no idea what it was or how to stop it. This was the early era of HIV, when the virus was spreading silently through communities worldwide and almost no one realized what was coming. At first, the cases seemed strange and rare. Doctors in New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles began reporting clusters of young, previously healthy men developing rare infections and cancers like Kaposi's sarcoma. Their immune systems were collapsing for no clear reason. The disease was first called GRID,
gay-related immune deficiency, because many of the earliest cases were among gay men. But soon it became clear this was bigger than any one community. Hemophiliacs, people who had received blood transfusions, and babies born to infected mothers began falling ill too. HIV was terrifying because it moved quietly. A person could look perfectly healthy for years while the virus slowly destroyed their immune system. By the time symptoms appeared, it was often too late. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and other opportunistic infections struck with deadly speed. In the early years, a diagnosis of AIDS was almost always a death sentence. Imagine what that felt like for people in the hardest-hit cities. Friends disappeared one after another. Funeral after funeral filled the calendar. Fear ran so deep that some families refused to hug their sick relatives, not knowing how the disease spread. Patients were shunned, sometimes even fired from their jobs. The stigma was so intense that many suffered alone. Governments were slow to react. Activists had to fight to get funding for research and public health campaigns. In the meantime, the virus spread across the globe. By the end of the 1980s, millions were infected. In some African countries, entire villages lost the generation of adults, leaving grandparents to raise children and economies on the verge of collapse. The turning point came with the development of antiretroviral drugs in the 1990s. For the first time, HIV was no longer a certain death sentence. It became a chronic, manageable condition. Today, with proper treatment, people with HIV can live long, healthy lives. But the early years were a nightmare, a time when humanity felt powerless against something it couldn't even see. Looking back, it's chilling to realize how close we came to losing even more lives. The early spread of HIV showed just how vulnerable we are to new diseases, and how crucial it is to respond quickly, fight stigma, and push for science to catch up.
Cholera Pandemics of the 1800s. The first sign was the smell. Streets reeked of sewage. River water was foul, and yet that was where people still drew their drinking water. In the 1800s, cities around the world were growing fast, but sanitation was lagging behind. Into this perfect storm came cholera, a disease so swift and merciless that it became known as the Blue Death, because victims' skin sometimes turned blue from dehydration before they died. Cholera is caused by a bacterium that spreads through contaminated water. Once inside the body, it triggers violent diarrhea and vomiting, draining a person's fluid so fast they can die within hours. In an age before modern medicine, that was horrifying. The first global cholera pandemic began in India in the early 1800s and spread along trade routes to the Middle East, Europe, and eventually the Americas. Imagine living in London, Paris, or New York at the time. One day you're healthy, the next day you collapse, and by morning you might be gone. Families watched loved ones die overnight, and no one could explain why it was happening. Some people thought cholera spread through bad air, so they burned tar or carried flowers to protect themselves. But the real culprit was right under their noses, the water they drank every day. In many seas, raw sewage flowed straight into the same rivers and wells used for drinking water. The outbreaks were terrifying. Entire neighborhoods emptied out as those who could afford it fled to the countryside. Hospitals overflowed. Horses pulling death carts clattered down cobblestone streets, collecting bodies. And the death toll kept climbing. Tens of millions worldwide over the course of the century. But cholera didn't just kill people, it changed society. In London, one doctor named John Snow, yes, before Game of Thrones, noticed that most of the cases in one outbreak were clustered around a single water pump on Broad Street. He convinced authorities to remove the pump handle, and the outbreak stopped. This was one of the first major pieces of evidence proving that diseases could spread through contaminated water, not air. Snow's work and the repeated cholera pandemics pushed cities to build modern sewer systems and clean water supplies. In a strange way, cholera forced humanity to upgrade its infrastructure, making cities healthier for future generations. But in the 1800s, for ordinary people, it was simply terror. You couldn't see it, you couldn't smell it until it was too late, and by the time you knew it was there, you might already be next. Even today, cholera outbreaks still happen where sanitation is poor, a reminder that this blue death hasn't completely left us, and that clean water is still one of the most powerful tools for keeping humanity alive. Plague of Athens. The sound of Athens was supposed to be loud, philosophers arguing in the agora, hammers ringing in workshops, soldiers drilling in the streets. But in 430 BCE, all those sounds faded. What replaced them was coughing, crying, and the endless toll of funeral bells. Athens, the proud heart of Greek democracy, was being gutted by a mysterious plague that would kill 1 in every 4 citizens and change the course of history. The city was already under siege by Sparta during the Peloponnesian War, and its population had swollen as refugees crowded behind the city walls. The conditions were perfect for disease: cramped living quarters, poor sanitation, and no way to escape. When the sickness arrived, it spread like wildfire. Eyewitness accounts from historians like Thucydides paint a haunting picture. People were struck suddenly with fevers, rashes, and bleeding. Some went blind. Many became so delirious they threw themselves into wells to cool off. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried, and mass graves became the only option. The social order collapsed. Family members abandoned the sick for fear of catching the disease. Laws and customs were ignored. Some Athenians turned to wild indulgence, figuring death was coming anyway. Others turned to prayer, but the gods stayed silent. The plague didn't just devastate the population, it devastated morale. Athens was at war, and losing a quarter of its people, including its great leader Pericles, was a blow the city never truly recovered from. Pericles had been the guiding hand of Athenian democracy, and with him gone, Athens descended into political chaos, making poor decisions that ultimately led to its defeat. For the ordinary citizen, it must have felt like the end of the world. Imagine living in a city you could not leave, knowing the air around you might carry death. Every day, you'd see neighbors collapse in the streets, hear the sound of funeral carts, and wonder when it would be your turn. To this day, historians and scientists aren't entirely sure what caused the plague. Theories range from typhoid fever to Ebola-like hemorrhagic diseases. Whatever it was, it left scars on Athens that lasted for generations. The plague of Athens was more than just a public health disaster. It was a turning point in history. If Athens had stayed strong, the Peloponnesian War might have ended differently, and democracy might have taken a different path. Instead, the city's golden age ended in sickness and despair. It's a sobering reminder that even the most brilliant societies can be undone not by armies, but by something too small to see.
Marburg and Ebola. A nurse walks into a patient's room and finds blood on the walls, not from violence, but from the patient himself, bleeding from his nose, eyes, and gums. This is what Marburg and Ebola do to the human body, and these outbreaks gave us a terrifying glimpse of what a true doomsday pandemic might look like. Marburg virus first appeared in 1967 in Germany, of all places, when lab workers handling African green monkeys started falling sick. At first, doctors thought it was just another fever. Then came the vomiting, the rashes, and finally the uncontrolled bleeding. The virus spread to hospital staff, then to families. Panic set in. Patients died quickly, some within days. Ebola followed a similar pattern when it first emerged in remote villages of Sudan and Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. This was no ordinary illness. People bled internally, their organs failed, and the death toll was staggering. In some outbreaks, as many as 90% of patients died. What made these viruses so terrifying wasn't just the symptoms, it was how contagious they seemed in small rural communities. Caregivers, nurses, and burial teams often got infected. Imagine living in a village where every hug, every shared cup of water could be a death sentence. Entire communities sometimes locked themselves away or fled into the forest, leaving the sick behind. The horror didn't stop with the human body. Ebola and Marburg also destroyed trust. People became afraid to go to hospitals, afraid of doctors in protective suits. In some places, riots broke out against health workers because people believed they were spreading the disease instead of stopping it. And yet, as bad as these outbreaks were, they were contained, mostly because they happened in remote places where the virus burned through victims before it could travel too far. That's the part that chills scientists. What if the next strain spreads more slowly, allowing people to travel before symptoms show? What if it reached a crowded city or an international airport before anyone realized what was happening? Outbreaks in recent decades, including the massive West African Ebola epidemic of 2014 to 2016, have shown us just how close we could come to global disaster. Thousands died despite modern medicine, and the world watched nervously to see if it would spread beyond control. Marburg and Ebola are reminders that nature has viruses far deadlier than anything we've ever faced on a global scale. We were lucky those outbreaks stayed small. If one of them ever mutates to spread as easily as the flu, we might not be so lucky next time.
Rinderpest Pandemic. Before the late 1800s, Africa's plains were alive with movement, herds of cattle, antelope, and buffalo stretching to the horizon. Then, almost overnight, they were gone. 9 out of every 10 cattle died from a disease called Rinderpest, a viral plague so deadly it didn't just wipe out animals, it triggered human famine that killed millions. Rinderpest is a cousin of measles, but instead of infecting people, it infects cloven-hooved animals like cattle. Once it arrived in Africa, likely brought by infected livestock from Asia during colonial expansions, it spread like wildfire. Cattle developed fevers, mouth sores, and diarrhea before dying within days. Entire herds dropped dead in the fields. For the people who relied on those animals, this was a disaster beyond comprehension. Cattle were food, wealth, transport, and status all at once. When they died, there was no meat, no milk, and no way to plow fields. Famine set in quickly. Some regions saw their human populations drop by as much as a third. And it wasn't just cattle. Wild grazers were hit too. Africa's iconic wildlife, from buffalo to wildebeest, died in staggering numbers. Lions and hyenas starved because their prey was gone. Even the landscape changed. Without herds to eat grass, thorny shrubs took over, changing the ecosystem and making some areas more prone to tsetse fly infestations, which brought sleeping sickness to humans and livestock alike. Colonial powers took advantage of the crisis. With local populations weakened by starvation, resistance to European conquest collapsed in many areas. In a grim twist of history, a virus helped pave the way for colonization. Imagine living through it, waking up to find your family's herd, your entire livelihood, lying dead and bloated in the sun. Your neighbors' herds are gone too. There's no food coming from anywhere else. Hunger deepens with every passing day, and there's no medicine, no cure, no way to stop it. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that scientists developed a successful vaccine for Rinderpest. And in 2011, the disease became only the second virus in history, after smallpox, to be completely eradicated worldwide. It was a huge victory for science, but it came too late for the millions who had suffered in the 19th century. Today, Africa's cattle herds have recovered, and the great migrations of wildebeest once again sweep across the Serengeti. But the memory of the Rinderpest Pandemic is a sobering reminder of how deeply human survival is tied to the animals we depend on, and how quickly that connection can be broken.
The Great Manchurian Plague. The snow in Harbin fell quietly that winter, but no one was there to see it. The streets were empty, the markets closed, and the city seemed to hold its breath. Between 1910 and 1911, a deadly outbreak swept through Manchuria, a form of pneumonic plague so lethal that nearly everyone who caught it died. Unlike bubonic plague, which spreads through fleas and causes the classic swollen buboes, pneumonic plague attacks the lungs and spreads person to person through coughing and sneezing. It kills with terrifying speed, sometimes within just 24 to 48 hours of the first symptoms. In Manchuria, once the outbreak began, it was unstoppable. The first cases were traced to fur trappers handling infected marmots in remote areas. From there, the disease rode the railway lines into booming trade cities like Harbin, where people lived in close quarters, and winter forced them indoors. Within weeks, thousands were dead. The scenes were grim. Entire families were found lifeless in their homes, overcome by fever and coughing blood.
Doctors and nurses fell sick as fast as they could treat others. Funeral workers couldn't keep up, so mass cremations were ordered, a rare and controversial decision in the region at the time, just to prevent piles of bodies from becoming new sources of infection. For ordinary people, it was a winter of fear. No one wanted to open their doors. Some starved because they were too afraid to leave home for food. The sound of coughing became a warning that someone nearby was as good as gone. One man who rose to the challenge was Dr. Wu Lian-te, a Chinese-Malaysian physician who helped organize the response. He promoted quarantine, isolation of patients, and even designed one of the first modern protective masks for doctors, a simple but effective tool that likely saved lives and inspired later mask designs used in other pandemics. But despite these efforts, the plague burned through the population. By the time it was finally contained in 1911, it had killed an estimated 60,000 people. The death rate was nearly 100%. If you caught it, you almost certainly didn't survive. What makes the Great Manchurian Plague so chilling is how modern it feels. Trains carried the infection quickly from city to city. Governments had to work together across borders to stop the spread. Quarantine zones were enforced and travel was restricted, all things we saw repeated during COVID-19 a century later. Standing in Harbin today, it's hard to picture the silence of that terrible winter. But for a few months in 1910 and 1911, the city was a ghost town, its streets lined not with shoppers and workers, but with funeral carts. The Great Manchurian Plague was short-lived, but it was a grim reminder of how fragile human life can be, and how fast a city can go from full of life to completely still.
Little Ice Age. Snow fell on fields of wheat that were supposed to be ready for harvest. Rivers froze so solid that people built markets and even held festivals on the ice. For centuries, across Europe and Asia, winters were longer, summers were colder, and crops failed again and again. This era is known as the Little Ice Age, and it pushed humanity to the brink more than once. Starting sometime in the 1300s, global temperatures dipped just enough to cause chaos. It wasn't a full ice age, with glaciers covering continents, but it was cold enough to shorten growing seasons, wipe out harvests, and send famine sweeping across entire regions. For ordinary farmers, this meant years of back-breaking work, ending with empty barns. The effects were devastating. Grain prices soared because there wasn't enough food to go around. People starved in their villages, and in cities, bread riots became common. In France, one particularly harsh winter left entire regions without food, fueling revolts that toppled governments. In China, crop failures led to mass migrations and rebellions that shook the foundations of dynasties. The cold didn't just kill by hunger. It helped disease spread. Malnutrition made people more vulnerable to outbreaks like the Black Death, which hit right in the middle of this chilly period. Some historians think the Little Ice Age made pandemics far worse than they might have been otherwise. Life during these centuries must have felt like a long, slow disaster. Imagine being a farmer who relies on the spring thaw
only to watch frost kill your seedlings in May. Or being a fisherman, finding rivers frozen over for months longer than usual, leaving your family with nothing to eat. Even the weather seemed cruel, with brutal storms and endless rains rotting crops in the field. The Little Ice Age also shaped culture. The fear and hardship found their way into art, with paintings depicting bleak winter landscapes and starving peasants. Folklore from the time is full of witches and spirits blamed for bad weather, because when survival depends on the harvest, you look for someone to blame when it fails. Eventually, the climate began to warm up again in the 1800s, but not before leaving its mark on history. Some scientists believe the cold contributed to events like the fall of the Ming Dynasty, the French Revolution, and even the Viking abandonment of Greenland. The Little Ice Age reminds us that humanity's survival has always been tied to the climate. Even a small shift in temperature, just a couple of degrees colder, was enough to starve millions and change the course of nations. Today, when we talk about climate change, it's easy to think of it as abstract or far away. But for centuries, climate shaped every meal, every war, every migration. And the Little Ice Age is proof that when the planet changes, human history changes with it.
Year 536. The dawn came late, and when it did, the sun was pale, as if someone had draped a veil across the sky. For 18 long months, the world lived in a strange twilight. Crops failed, famine spread, and entire kingdoms stumbled. Historians now called the year 536 the worst year to be alive, and with good reason. We know something catastrophic happened because writers from across the world recorded it. A Byzantine historian wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon. Chinese records talk about summer snow and ruined harvests. Even in Ireland, chroniclers mention a failure of bread that lasted for years. Scientists have pieced together the mystery. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica show massive spikes in volcanic material around this time. That means somewhere, possibly Iceland, a gigantic volcanic eruption blasted ash and sulfur high into the atmosphere. This dust cloud wrapped the planet and blocked sunlight, triggering a global cold snap. The results were devastating. Temperatures dropped, causing harvest after harvest to fail. People starved by the millions. In China, drought and frost led to widespread famine. In Europe, the already fragile societies left after the fall of the Roman Empire were thrown into deeper misery. But the misery didn't stop there. Just a few years later, in 541 CE, the plague of Justinian, history's first recorded bubonic plague pandemic, struck, killing tens of millions. It was as if nature had delivered a 1-2 punch, first famine, then disease. Imagine what life would have felt like during those 18 months of darkness. You wake up and the sky never looks bright. Noon feels like dusk. The air is cold and damp even in summer. People must have thought the end of the world was near. Some likely turned to religion, others to superstition, desperate to explain why the sun itself seemed to have abandoned them. The economic and political consequences were enormous. Trade routes collapsed.
Empires lost tax revenue as population starved. Some historians believe these events delayed Europe's recovery from the Dark Ages by centuries, setting back human progress in ways we can still trace. What makes this story so chilling is that it could happen again. A single massive volcanic eruption can still throw enough material into the sky to cool the planet. Scientists have seen it happen in smaller ways after eruptions like Tambora in 1815. The year 536 is a reminder that humanity is never completely in control. One volcano was enough to plunge the world into darkness and push societies to the brink. The fact that we are here at all means our ancestors endured that strange, dim world and somehow kept going until the sun finally returned.
Great Bengal Famine. 10 million lives gone in just a few years. That's how devastating the Great Bengal Famine of 1770 was. It didn't just starve a region, it rewrote the history of India, shook confidence in its rulers, and left scars that lasted for generations. The famine struck Bengal, a fertile region in eastern India that had long been the breadbasket of the subcontinent. But in the late 1760s, disaster struck. The monsoons failed, rains were erratic, and crops began to wither. At the same time, Bengal was under the control of the British East India Company, whose tax collectors demanded revenue whether the fields produced grain or not. The result was catastrophic. With less food and the same crushing tax burden, farmers were forced to sell what little they had just to pay. Grain prices skyrocketed beyond what ordinary people could afford. Starvation began to spread. Imagine walking through a Bengal village during those years. The fields are dry and cracked. The market stalls are empty. People sit by the roadside, too weak to move. Contemporary accounts describe corpses left unburied, rivers clogged with the dead, and dogs and jackals roaming freely through abandoned villages. The famine didn't just kill through hunger, it brought disease with it. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, allowing dysentery and smallpox to sweep through the population. Even those who survived the hunger sometimes succumbed to illness. The British East India Company was widely criticized for how it handled the crisis. Instead of suspending taxes or releasing enough stored grain to feed the people, many officials focused on maintaining profit and order. Some historians argue that their failure to act quickly turned a natural disaster into a human-made catastrophe. The numbers are staggering. An estimated 1/3 of Bengal's population died, about 10 million people. Entire communities were wiped out. Farmland lay empty because there was no one left to work it. Social structures collapsed as families scattered or were destroyed. The aftermath reshaped Bengal's society. The labor shortage that followed allowed some surviving farmers to demand better terms from landlords, but the trauma lingered for decades. The Great Bengal Famine is a stark reminder that hunger is rarely just about the weather. It's about politics
economics, and human choices. When those in power fail to act, a bad harvest can turn into mass death. Standing in Bengal today, it's hard to imagine the silence of those empty villages. But the famine's legacy lives on in the memory of a society that learned, painfully, what happens when nature and human neglect work together.
Irish Potato Famine. A lone cottage sits on a wind-swept Irish hillside. The fire has gone out. The fields outside are overgrown, and the door hangs open. The family that once lived here is gone, some to America, some to the grave. This was the reality of the Irish potato famine, a catastrophe that emptied villages and reshaped the destiny of a nation. The crisis began in 1845, when a fungus-like disease called Phytophthora infestans swept across Ireland's potato fields. Potatoes weren't just a crop. They were the backbone of the Irish diet, especially for the poor. When the blight struck, entire harvests turned black and rotten almost overnight. At first, people hoped it was a one-year disaster, but the blight came back year after year, until there was nothing left to eat. Starvation became widespread. People boiled grass, ate nettles, and dug for shellfish along the coasts just to survive. Contemporary reports describe children with hollow cheeks and swollen bellies collapsing by the roadside. But hunger wasn't the only killer. Disease followed closely behind. Typhus, cholera, and dysentery swept through weakened populations, finishing off many who had survived the worst of the famine. The British government, which ruled Ireland at the time, sent some relief: soup kitchens, workhouses, and limited food shipments, but it wasn't enough. Worse, food was still being exported from Ireland to England during the famine, leading many to see the crisis as not just a natural disaster, but a failure of colonial policy. The result was staggering. Over 1 million people died, and at least another million fled the country entirely, boarding coffin ships bound for North America. The voyage was perilous, with disease spreading easily in the cramped holds, but for many it was the only hope of survival. The Great Famine wasn't just a tragedy of hunger. It was a turning point in Irish history, one that scattered its people across the globe. When you walk through the Irish countryside today and see those lonely, abandoned stone cottages, it's hard to not imagine the families who once lived there and the heartbreak that forced them to leave.
North Korea's arduous march. The streets were quiet, except for the rattle of empty rice bowls. In the mid-1990s, North Korea faced one of the deadliest famines in the modern era. An event so devastating it nearly collapsed the regime. North Koreans call it the Arduous March, a phrase that sounds almost poetic, but for those who lived through it, It was a time of hunger, fear, and desperation. The famine wasn't just caused by bad luck. In 1995, severe floods washed away farmland, destroyed grain stores, and wrecked the country's already fragile infrastructure. But the disaster struck a system that was already weak. The fall of the Soviet Union had cut off vital food and fuel aid. The country's centrally planned agriculture system couldn't adapt quickly. When the crops failed, there was no safety net. For ordinary people, the results were catastrophic. The state food distribution system collapsed and rations dropped to almost nothing. Families boiled tree bark and grass to survive. Children scavenged in fields looking for insects to eat. Many starved quietly in their homes, and entire neighborhoods thinned out as the famine deepened. Defectors' testimonies paint a harrowing picture. Bodies left in train stations, children fainting from hunger in classrooms, parents forced to choose which child to feed. Some turned to desperate measures, bartering household items for a handful of corn, or risking dangerous escapes across the border into China. The death toll is still debated. Estimates range from several 100,000 to over 2 million. But what's clear is that the famine fundamentally changed North Korean society. People who had relied on the government for everything were suddenly forced to fend for themselves. Informal black markets called jangmadang began to appear as people traded whatever they could to survive. These markets would later become a permanent feature of North Korean life, slowly reshaping the economy from the ground up. Politically, the famine was a critical test for the regime. Kim Jong-il, who had just taken power after his father's death, faced the risk of mass revolt. But the government tightened control, cracked down on dissent, and used propaganda to frame the famine as a shared national struggle. Even today, the arduous march remains a sensitive topic inside North Korea. Official narratives often downplay the scale of the disaster, but for survivors, the memories are vivid. The endless hunger, the loss of neighbors, the eerie quiet of towns where most of the population had died or fled. The famine didn't bring down the regime, but it left deep scars on the country's psyche. It's a modern reminder that famine isn't just a thing of the past, and that hunger can reshape a nation's destiny as powerfully as war.
In 1930s, the Dust Bowl. The wind picked up, and by noon the sky was the color of rust. Dust crept under doors, coated dinner plates, and turned day into night. In the 1930s, farmers across the American Midwest faced a disaster so severe it nearly emptied the Great Plains. This was the Dust Bowl, a mix of drought, over-farming, and economic collapse that almost ended farming in the heart of the United States. The Great Plains had been booming farmland for decades. Tractors plowed up millions of acres of native prairie grass to plant wheat.
But when a severe drought hit in the early 1930s, there was nothing to hold the soil down. Strong winds swept across the flat land and carried the topsoil away, turning it into giant black blizzards. These storms were apocalyptic. Entire houses disappeared under dunes of dust. Cars stalled as air filters clogged. People wore wet cloths over their faces just to breathe. The dust was so fine it got into lungs, causing dust pneumonia that killed thousands, especially children. And this wasn't just one bad year. The storms lasted nearly a decade, coming back again and again. For farming families, it felt like a war against nature they couldn't win. Crops withered in the dry soil, livestock starved or suffocated, and bank foreclosures forced thousands off their land. At the same time, the Great Depression had already crushed the economy, leaving farmers with little money and no safety net. When they lost their crops, they lost everything. Many packed up what they could and headed west in battered trucks, hoping to find work in California. These Okies, as they were called, often unfairly, since they came from multiple states, not just Oklahoma, faced discrimination and hardship, living in makeshift camps and working for low wages. For those who stayed behind, survival meant adapting. Some farmers learned new soil conservation methods, planting windbreaks, rotating crops, and leaving fields fallow to let the land recover. The federal government eventually stepped in with programs to teach sustainable farming practices and provide relief. Slowly, the rains returned and the Dust Bowl ended. But by then, the Great Plains had lost nearly 1 million people to migration, and the memory of those dark, choking skies would never fade. The Dust Bowl wasn't just an environmental disaster. It was a cultural one. It inspired songs, novels, and photography that captured the resilience and suffering of the people who lived through it. It also changed how Americans thought about land management, teaching a hard lesson about what happens when human ambition pushes an ecosystem too far. Standing on the plains today, it's hard to imagine the sky black with dust and the air so thick you couldn't see a yard ahead. But for those who lived it, the Dust Bowl was proof that even the richest farmland can turn against you if you forget how fragile it really is.
Sahel Drought. 30 million lives were at risk, and the sky stayed empty. Between 1968 and 1974, the Sahel region of Africa, a belt of land just south of the Sahara Desert, was gripped by one of the most devastating droughts of the 20th century. For 6 long years, the rains failed, and millions of people were pushed to the edge of starvation. The Sahel stretches across countries like Mali, Niger, Chad, and Senegal, and its people depend heavily on seasonal rainfall to grow millet, sorghum, and keep livestock alive. But in the late 1960s, the climate shifted. The rainy season shrank, then nearly disappeared altogether. What little grass grew quickly turned to dust, and wells dried up. For the nomadic herders who make their living moving cattle, goats, and camels across the plains, this was catastrophic. Animals began dying by the thousands, leaving families without food or income. Farmers watched their fields turn into cracked earth. Soon, famine swept through villages. Aid workers and journalists described heartbreaking scenes: children with swollen bellies from malnutrition, mothers too weak to nurse their babies, and long lines of people waiting for a single bowl of grain at relief camps. Entire communities packed up and walked for miles in search of food and water, some collapsing on the journey. The death toll is hard to pin down, but estimates range from several 100,000 to well over 1 million lives lost. For many who survived, the famine left lasting trauma. Family members gone, herds wiped out, and traditional ways of life shattered. The crisis drew global attention, becoming one of the first modern examples of a climate disaster broadcast on international television. Footage of starving children shocked viewers in Europe and America and sparked massive humanitarian relief efforts. Organizations like UNICEF and the World Food Program scaled up operations, flying in tons of food and medicine. But the drought also revealed deep systemic issues: poor infrastructure, limited government response, and international politics that sometimes slowed aid delivery. Even after the rains returned, recovery was slow. Many families had sold off what little they owned just to survive, and rebuilding herds and farms took years. The Sahel Drought also taught the world a lesson about climate vulnerability. Scientists began studying the links between rainfall patterns, desertification, and human activity, realizing that overgrazing and deforestation may have made the region more fragile. Today, efforts like the Great Green Wall, a massive reforestation project, or attempts to prevent a tragedy like the Sahel famine from happening again. For those who lived through it, the drought was more than just a natural disaster. It was a test of endurance. The image of an empty sky over an empty granary became a symbol of how quickly life can unravel when the rains stopped coming.
Global cooling scare. Another ice age? Screamed the magazine covers in the 1970s. It wasn't science fiction. For a brief moment, scientists and the public genuinely worried that the planet was heading toward a sudden deep freeze that could collapse agriculture and starve millions. This fear didn't come out of nowhere. From the 1940s to the 1970s, global temperatures dipped slightly after decades of warming. Winters grew harsher in some regions, and snowstorms hit places that weren't used to them. Scientists began to wonder if this was the start of a bigger trend, maybe even the next ice age. Part of the cooling was caused by human activity. Industrial pollution was pumping aerosols and particulates into the atmosphere, blocking some of the sun's heat. Combined with natural climate cycles, the result was a noticeable chill. Popular media ran with the idea. Articles in major newspapers and magazines speculated about advancing glaciers, failed harvests, and worldwide famine. Some scientists warned that if cooling continued, countries might face food shortages on a massive scale within decades. It wasn't hard to imagine. The memory of the Dust Bowl and other agricultural crises was still fresh. For ordinary people, this was unnerving.
Imagine living in a city that had just been hit by a brutal snowstorm, then reading that it might be a preview of a much colder future. The idea that human civilization could be undone not by heat, but by cold, captured the public imagination. Governments took the idea seriously enough to begin studying how to secure food supplies and prepare for possible climate shocks. Some researchers proposed radical solutions, like melting the polar ice caps on purpose to prevent a new ice age, ideas that sound wild today. But by the late 1970s and early 1980s, the data shifted. Temperatures began to rise again, and attention turned from cooling to global warming, the problem we're still grappling with today. The global cooling scare faded into history, remembered more as a snapshot of a moment when humanity briefly feared freezing rather than frying. It's worth noting that the scientific consensus of the time wasn't as unanimous as the headlines made it seem. Many researchers were already warning about greenhouse gases and warming trends even then. But it was the possibility of sudden cooling that grabbed the public's attention. Looking back, the global cooling scare feels almost quaint. But it's also a reminder of how sensitive humanity is to shifts in climate. A few decades of colder weather were enough to spark global debate about survival. And it shows how quickly the conversation can change. In just a few years, the world went from fearing snow-covered cities to fearing melting ice caps. Proof that climate and our understanding of it can turn on a dime.
Mount Pinatubo, 1991 eruption. The roar came first, a deep, rolling thunder that lasted for minutes, and then the sky went black. In June 1991, Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted in one of the most powerful volcanic events of the 20th century. It didn't just devastate the local area, it briefly cooled the entire planet and disrupted harvests around the world. Pinatubo had been quiet for centuries, but in early 1991, earthquakes and steam explosions warned that something big was coming. Scientists rushed to the site, and their monitoring likely saved tens of thousands of lives when they urged mass evacuations. Still, when the volcano finally blew on June 15th, the scale was staggering. The eruption shot ash 35 kilometers or 22 miles into the stratosphere, creating a plume that spread around the globe. Sulfur dioxide gas mixed with water vapor to form a thin veil of aerosols that circled the planet and reflected sunlight back into space. The result? The Earth's average temperature dropped by nearly 0.5 degrees Celsius, or almost 1 degree Fahrenheit, for more than a year. This sudden cooling might sound small, but it was enough to disrupt rainfall patterns and growing seasons. Farmers in several parts of the world saw delayed harvests or reduced yields. Some regions experienced unusually cold summers, while others saw too much rain as weather systems shifted. For the people living near Pinatubo, the disaster was immediate and personal. Whole towns were buried under meters of ash. Roofs collapsed from the weight.
The combination of ashfall and heavy monsoon rains created deadly mudflows, or lars, that roared down river valleys, wiping out villages. Hundreds of thousands were displaced, many permanently. The eruption also had a strange, eerie beauty. Sunsets around the world turned brilliant shades of red and orange as the volcanic haze scattered light. People thousands of miles away saw spectacular skies without realizing they were witnessing the effects of a disaster. What made Pinatubo so remarkable was that it became a case study for scientists. The data they gathered helped improve our understanding of how volcanoes can affect global climate. It also gave researchers a real-world example of what happens when you pump reflective particles into the atmosphere, a concept sometimes discussed as a possible geoengineering solution to climate change. Despite its power, Pinatubo was a wake-up call that we were lucky. If it had been even larger, on the scale of supervolcanoes like Toba or Tambora, the cooling might have lasted for years and triggered widespread famine. Today, the mountain is quiet again, partly collapsed into a beautiful crater lake. But for those who remember 1991, Pinatubo is a reminder that a single mountain can change the planet's thermostat and remind us how fragile our food systems really are.
Massive locust swarms. At first, it looked like a storm on the horizon. Then it grew darker, louder, until the sky itself seemed to move. What people thought was a cloud was actually billions of wings. Locust swarms have terrified humanity for millennia, and when they descended, they could strip entire regions bare in hours, leaving nothing but dust and stalks where crops once stood. Locusts are just grasshoppers until conditions are right. When rains follow long, dry periods, grasshopper populations explode. They undergo a transformation, both physically and behaviorally, turning into swarm mode. Then they gather in massive numbers, billions strong, and take off together, flying with the wind, devouring everything in their path. For farming societies throughout history, this was one of the most feared disasters imaginable. Imagine spending months planting and tending your fields, only to watch them vanish in an afternoon under a living, buzzing cloud. Families would have stood helpless as entire harvests were consumed before their eyes. Records of locust plagues go back thousands of years. The Bible famously describes them as one of the plagues of Egypt. In ancient China, imperial court records mention famines triggered by swarms. In the 1800s, settlers in the American Midwest battled the Rocky Mountain locust, a swarm so large it was said to cover an area the size of California. People reported hearing the swarm before they saw it, a low, roaring hum that grew until it drowned out all other sounds. The aftermath was devastating. With crops gone, famine often followed.
Livestock starved because there was no grass left for them to graze. People tried everything to stop the insects, banging pots, lighting fires, digging trenches, but once a swarm landed, there was little to be done. Some governments offered bounties for locust eggs. Communities organized mass collection campaigns, scooping up sacks of eggs to burn them before they hatched. But the fight often felt hopeless until the swarm moved on of its own accord. Even in modern times, locust swarms remain a threat. In 2020, East Africa faced one of the worst outbreaks in decades, with billions of locusts devouring crops across multiple countries. Modern pesticides and surveillance can help, but if conditions are right, warm weather, wet soil, the swarms can still form faster than they can be stopped. Locust plagues remind us that sometimes the most destructive forces aren't earthquakes or volcanoes, but living things following ancient instincts. To stand in a field while a swarm passes is to feel very small, powerless against a force that turns the very sky into an enemy. Cuban Missile Crisis. The clock was one tick away from midnight. For 13 days in October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than it ever has before or since. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis, a showdown between the United States and the Soviet Union that could have ended human civilization in less than an hour. It started when American spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. These weren't theoretical threats. Once operational, the missiles could strike almost every major U.S. city in minutes. President John F. Kennedy faced an impossible decision: act too slowly and risk nuclear blackmail, act too aggressively and risk triggering World War III. For nearly 2 weeks, the world teetered on the edge. The U.S. imposed a naval quarantine around Cuba to block more Soviet shipments. Warships faced off at sea. Fighter jets scrambled. Soviet missile crews in Cuba worked around the clock to get their weapons ready. Inside the White House, Kennedy and his advisors debated every move. Some pushed for airstrikes to destroy the missiles, even if it meant killing Soviet troops. Others urged diplomacy. The wrong choice could mean mushroom clouds over Washington, Moscow, London, and possibly the end of humanity as we know it. Meanwhile, ordinary people around the world lived with a constant dread. Families built fallout shelters. School children practiced duck and cover drills. People wondered if this was the last week they'd ever see. The crisis reached its peak on Black Saturday, October 27th, when an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba and another accidentally flew into Soviet airspace over Siberia. Military commanders were on hair-trigger alert, and a single miscommunication could have sparked all-out war. But behind the scenes, quiet diplomacy prevailed. A secret deal was struck. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. would secretly agree to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended without a shot fired, but just barely. Looking back, what's chilling is how close we really were. We now know there were more nuclear weapons in Cuba than the U.S. realized at the time, and Soviet submarine commanders had orders to use nuclear torpedoes if attacked. If even one officer had made the wrong call, the world might have been plunged into nuclear winter. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains a sobering reminder that human survival sometimes depends on calm heads in the most stressful moments. For 13 days, civilization dangled by a thread, and by sheer luck and careful diplomacy, we're still here to talk about it. Able Archer, 1983. Somewhere deep in a Soviet bunker, warning lights blinked. To Moscow's generals, it looked like NATO was preparing to launch a nuclear strike. The year was 1983, and the world was about to stumble into Armageddon, not by intention, but by misunderstanding. Able Archer 83 was a NATO training exercise designed to simulate how the alliance would respond to a nuclear attack. For 10 tense days in November, Western forces practiced everything, raising alert levels, moving troops, and even running mock communications about nuclear weapon use. To NATO, it was just a drill, but to the Soviet Union, it looked suspiciously real. The early 1980s were already some of the most dangerous years of the Cold War. The Soviet leadership believed the U.S. might try a surprise first strike to eliminate them. When they saw NATO suddenly ramping up activity, increasing radio traffic, and moving aircraft, they feared this was the cover for the real thing. Soviet intelligence went on high alert. Nuclear forces were readied. Strategic bombers were put on standby. In East Germany and Poland, pilots reportedly sat in cockpits with engines running, ready to launch at a moment's notice. A single false alarm or misread radar blip could have triggered a massive retaliation, a war that would have killed hundreds of millions. Inside the Kremlin, paranoia was running high. Only weeks earlier, Soviet air defenses had shot down Korean Air 007 after mistaking it for a spy plane, killing 269 civilians and escalating tensions with the West. And just 2 months before Able Archer, Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov had famously prevented a nuclear launch by correctly identifying a satellite warning as a false alarm. The entire world was walking a very thin line. What's remarkable is that NATO didn't realize how close things were until later. To them, Able Archer was routine, just another exercise. But declassified documents and testimonies from former Soviet officials later revealed just how terrified the USSR had been. Some historians argue that 1983 may have been the closest the world came to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the end, the exercise ended, the tension eased, and the missiles stayed in their silos. But it left a chilling lesson. During the Cold War, even a misunderstanding could have ended civilization. For ordinary people at the time, life went on. Kids went to school, people watched TV. No one knew how close they'd just come to becoming shadows burned into walls. Able Archer 83 reminds us that sometimes the scariest threats aren't deliberate attacks, but accidents and misinterpretations. The fact that we survived that November might have come down to nothing more than caution, luck, and the decision of a few key people not to push the button.
Stanislav Petrov's choice. The sirens were blaring, the screens were flashing, and the clock was ticking down to nuclear war. In the early hours of September 26, 1983, Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov sat in a command center outside Moscow, staring at a screen that told him the unthinkable. American nuclear missiles were on their way. Petrov's job was simple: detect incoming attacks and report them up the chain of command. If he confirmed what the system was showing, the Soviet Union would almost certainly launch a full-scale nuclear retaliation. Within minutes, missiles would be flying toward the United States, and global thermonuclear war would be unavoidable. But something about the warning didn't sit right with him. The satellite system reported 5 missiles inbound. Just 5. Petrov reasoned that if the U.S. were going to strike first, they would launch hundreds, not a handful. And there were no corroborating radar signals yet. He made a decision that went against his orders. He reported the alarm as a false one. And he was right. The attack was actually sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, confusing the early warning satellite system. By staying calm and thinking critically in that moment, Petrov may have single-handedly prevented World War III. Imagine the pressure of that choice. The whole room waiting on your call. The knowledge that if you were wrong, Soviet cities could be obliterated in minutes, and it would be partly your fault for not retaliating. The weight of the world, literally, was on one man's shoulders. Petrov was never hailed as a hero by the Soviet government. In fact, he was reportedly reprimanded for not following protocol exactly. For years, his story remained classified, known only to a few. When it finally became public in the 1990s, the world realized how close we had come to nuclear annihilation, and how much we owed to a man who chose logic over fear. The incident is sometimes called the day the world almost ended, and it's not an exaggeration. Had Petrov passed the alarm along as real, the Soviet leadership might have launched a counterstrike. The U.S. would have retaliated. Hundreds of millions could have died, and modern civilization as we know it might have been gone. Petrov later said he didn't think of himself as a hero. He just didn't want to be responsible for starting a nuclear war by mistake. But that moment in 1983 is a powerful reminder that sometimes history doesn't turn on battles or treaties. It turns on one person sitting alone in a room, making the hardest decision of their life.
Norwegian Rocket Incident. A hand hovered over the launch key, waiting for the order. In January 1995, Russia's early warning systems detected what looked like an incoming U.S. missile, and for a few minutes, the world was closer to nuclear war than most people ever knew. The object in question wasn't a missile at all. It was a Norwegian research rocket, launched to study the northern lights. Norway had even warned Russia in advance, but the message had been lost somewhere in the chain of communication. So when radar operators saw the rocket's flight path, they panicked. It looked eerily similar to the trajectory of a U.S. Trident missile. Within minutes, alarms went off in Russia's command centers. The nuclear briefcase, the Cheget, Russia's version of the U.S. football, was brought to President Boris Yeltsin. This was the only known time a Russian leader has actually activated his nuclear launch codes in response to a perceived threat. For a few tense moments, military officials prepared for the possibility of launching a retaliatory strike. The logic was brutal. If this was the first missile of a surprise attack, more would follow. Waiting could mean losing Russia's ability to respond. But then came the crucial decision. Yeltsin and his advisors held off just long enough to gather more data. They watched the rocket's flight path and saw it harmlessly fall into the sea, far from any target. The order to launch was never given. The world exhaled, and most of humanity never even knew how close it had come to destruction. Imagine those few minutes inside the Kremlin, the tension, the weight of knowing that one wrong call could end civilization. Outside, ordinary people went about their day, completely unaware that the fate of the world was being decided in near real time. The incident revealed just how fragile nuclear peace can be. It wasn't malice, aggression, or a hostile act that nearly triggered catastrophe. It was a research project and a breakdown in communication. In the years since, the Norwegian rocket incident has become a case study in the dangers of hair-trigger nuclear alert systems. The fact that the situation was resolved peacefully was partly luck, partly restraint, and a reminder that we depend on leaders to stay calm under the worst possible pressure. It's sobering to think that on that January day, one misunderstood launch could have turned cities into ash clouds within an hour. But it's also a reminder that sometimes history stays on track because someone, somewhere, pauses before pressing the button. Chernobyl, 1986. A blue light shimmered above the reactor, ghostly and unnatural. It was the middle of the night on April 26, 1986, when Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. And for a brief, terrifying window, Europe came dangerously close to becoming uninhabitable. The disaster began during a late-night safety test that went horribly wrong. Operators shut down too many safety systems, and the reactor became unstable. In seconds, a massive steam explosion ripped through the core, blowing the roof off the building and releasing radioactive material into the sky. Firefighters arrived first, not knowing they were walking straight into one of the most radioactive places on Earth. Many of them fought the flames with no protection, unknowingly sealing their own fates. Witnesses reported the eerie sight of graphite chunks, pieces of the reactor core, glowing on the ground. Some men picked them up with their bare hands. The radiation released in those first hours was staggering, dozens of times worse than the Hiroshima bomb. But what scared Soviet officials most was what could still happen. If the molten reactor core melted through its base and hit the large pool of water below, it could have caused a massive steam explosion that would have scattered radioactive material across much of Europe. Some scientists feared this China syndrome scenario could have rendered parts of Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond uninhabitable for centuries. To stop this, teams of workers were sent into near-suicidal missions, draining water from underneath the reactor, tunneling by hand to install a cooling system, and dumping sand, lead, and boron from helicopters to smother the fire. Thousands of liquidators, as they were called, risked their lives to contain the disaster. Many suffered severe radiation sickness, but their work may have prevented a far worse catastrophe. For ordinary citizens, the danger was invisible. Children played outside while radioactive fallout settled on their hair and clothes. It took days before authorities ordered evacuations of nearby towns, including Pripyat, which had been home to 50,000 people. Today, that city still stands empty, a frozen time capsule of the Soviet 1980s. The long-term effects of Chernobyl are still debated, but it unquestionably spreads radioactive contamination across Europe. Farmers had to destroy crops, and in some regions, wild mushrooms and game meat are still considered unsafe to eat, even decades later. Chernobyl wasn't just an industrial accident. It was a moment when humanity got a glimpse of just how dangerous nuclear technology can be when it spins out of control. If those workers hadn't acted quickly, the worst-case scenario might have left a radioactive scar across half a continent. Today, Reactor 4 sits under a massive steel sarcophagus, silent, contained, but never completely safe. It's a reminder that one night in 1986 almost changed the map of Europe forever. 3 Mile Island. The alarms wouldn't stop. Inside the control room of the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania, red lights were flashing and warning sirens were blaring. It was March 28, 1979, and operators were facing a nightmare, a malfunction that could lead to a full nuclear meltdown. It all started with a simple equipment failure, a stuck valve. What should have been a routine glitch turned into a chain reaction of human errors and misread signals. Operators believed they were dealing with too much water in the reactor, when in fact the core was dangerously exposed. As water levels dropped, the reactor overheated. Parts of the uranium fuel rods melted, releasing radioactive gases into the cooling system. In the control room, confusion reigned as engineers tried to make sense of conflicting data. Outside the plant, news began to spread. Government officials debated whether to evacuate nearby communities. Families packed their cars, unsure if they were about to face a radiation cloud. Pregnant women and young children within a 5-mile radius were advised to leave, and thousands did. For several tense days, the nation was on edge. Television news ran continuous coverage. People feared a hydrogen explosion that could rip the reactor apart and send radioactive fallout across Pennsylvania and beyond. In the end, disaster was narrowly averted. Operators managed to cool the reactor and stabilize the situation before it turned catastrophic. The meltdown was only partial, and while some radioactive gas escaped, the exposure to the public was relatively small. But the psychological impact was enormous. 3 Mile Island became a turning point for nuclear power in the United States. Public confidence in nuclear energy plummeted, and no new reactors were ordered for decades after the incident. It sparked a national debate about safety, regulations, and whether the risks of nuclear power were worth taking. For the people who lived nearby, the fear lingered. Many reported health problems they believed were linked to the accident, though studies have struggled to prove widespread radiation effects. But the anxiety, the sense that a disaster had almost happened, was real. The near miss also led to sweeping safety reforms. The nuclear industry adopted stricter training, better equipment, and clearer procedures to avoid the kind of confusion that nearly turned 3 Mile Island into a catastrophe. Looking back, what's chilling is how close it came to being far worse. If the core had completely melted, the radioactive release could have been devastating, contaminating a wide area and forcing mass evacuations. 3 Mile Island is remembered not for what it did, but for what might have happened. It was a moment when America learned just how high the stakes are when it comes to nuclear power, and how much depends on getting it right when alarms go off.
Biorisk with Smallpox Labs. What would happen if smallpox escaped a freezer tomorrow? It's a chilling question, because even though smallpox was declared eradicated in 1980, the virus isn't completely gone. Samples are still stored today in 2 high-security laboratories, one in the United States, one in Russia. And history has shown that accidents do happen. Smallpox was once one of humanity's greatest killers. It scarred, blinded, and killed hundreds of millions over the centuries. The global vaccination campaign that wiped it out is one of medicine's greatest triumphs. But after its eradication, the question became, should we destroy the last remaining samples or keep them for research in case we ever need to make more vaccines? The decision was to keep them, but that comes with risk. There have already been close calls. In 1978, a medical photographer in Birmingham, England, died after a lab accident released smallpox from a research facility. The virus spread through a ventilation shaft, infecting her despite strict safety protocols. Even decades after eradication, surprises still turn up. In 2014, scientists cleaning out an old storage room at a U.S. government facility found vials of smallpox that had been forgotten for decades. Luckily, they were still sealed and intact, but the discovery raised questions about how many other unknown samples might still be out there. The fear isn't just accidents. Experts worry about the possibility of theft or misuse. Smallpox is so contagious and so deadly
that even a single accidental release could spark an outbreak in a world where routine vaccination has stopped. Most people alive today have no immunity, which means the virus would spread faster and kill more effectively than it did in the past. Imagine the chaos if such an outbreak happened today. Airports would shut down. Cities would go into lockdown. Mass vaccination campaigns would begin overnight, but it would take time to produce enough doses, and time is what you don't have when a virus can spread from person to person in days. This is why smallpox research labs have some of the strictest biosafety standards in the world. Scientists work in pressurized suits, in sealed rooms with multiple containment layers, monitored 24/7. But no system is perfect, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The story of smallpox in labs is a reminder that eradicating a disease doesn't always mean we're done with it. The decision to keep the virus was made to protect humanity, but it also means we live with a tiny, frozen, ever-present risk. One freezer door left ajar, one human error, and we could be facing one of history's deadliest killers all over again. The danger of automated war. The screen flashed red, the sirens blared, and the computer delivered its verdict. Incoming nuclear strike detected. No missiles had actually been launched, but at that moment, the decision to retaliate was one step away from being made by a machine. During the Cold War, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union built increasingly sophisticated early warning systems to detect enemy missile launches. Satellites, radar arrays, and command computers were all linked together so that leaders could respond within minutes if an attack was coming. The idea was to make sure neither side could be caught off guard. But this automation came with a terrifying flaw. What if the system was wrong? It happened more than once. In 1983, the Soviet Union's new Okoze satellite system reported that 5 U.S. missiles had been launched toward Russia. The data was passed to the command center, where Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was on duty. Protocol called for him to report it immediately as a confirmed attack, but Petrov hesitated, reasoning that a real first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not just 5. His decision to classify it as a false alarm likely prevented a full-scale nuclear war. And Petrov's incident wasn't the only one. In 1979, a computer training tape was accidentally left running at NORAD, the U.S. Early Warning Center. It simulated a massive Soviet missile strike, and for a few terrifying minutes, the United States believed World War III had begun. Bomber crews scrambled to their planes before the error was discovered. The fear of automation is simple. Computers are fast, but they don't know when to doubt themselves. If the system had been fully automated, if the decision to launch had been left entirely to a machine, there's a real chance the world could have experienced a nuclear exchange based on a glitch. Imagine living through one of those false alarms, sitting in a command bunker, heart pounding, waiting for confirmation, while knowing you might just have minutes left before deciding whether to end human civilization. Today, many nuclear-armed nations still maintain launch-on-warning postures, meaning they are prepared to retaliate as soon as an incoming strike is detected. AI and automated decision-making are being woven even more deeply into military systems. Supporters argue this shortens response times and prevents surprise attacks. Critics warn it also removes the human hesitation that, at least in 1983, saved the planet. The near misses we've had so far are chilling reminders that a single glitch or false positive could one day trigger an irreversible chain of events. Technology might make war faster, but it also means one bad signal could make it final.
Kyshtym Disaster. The night sky lit up with a strange glow over the Ural Mountains in 1957. There was no warning siren, no official statement, just a silent flash, and later a deadly cloud drifting over the countryside. This was the Kyshtym Disaster, one of the worst nuclear accidents in history, but one the Soviet Union kept secret for decades. The explosion happened at the Mayor nuclear facility, where waste from plutonium production was stored in huge underground tanks. One of those tanks, holding tons of highly radioactive material, overheated when its cooling system failed. The resulting chemical blast had the force of about 70 to 100 tons of TNT, scattering radioactive debris across a massive area. Unlike Chernobyl decades later, there was no reactor fire, but the contamination was still catastrophic. The radioactive cloud spread over more than 20,000 square kilometers, or around 7,700 square miles, exposing hundreds of thousands of people to dangerous levels of radiation. What makes the story haunting is how little the local population knew. Villagers saw a bright flash and heard a distant boom, but were given no explanation. Days later, soldiers arrived, ordered evacuations, and sometimes burned homes and crops to prevent further contamination. Entire villages were erased from the map, their names removed from records. The fallout created what became known as the East Ural Radioactive Trace, an area so contaminated that it remained off-limits for decades. People who weren't evacuated quickly suffered radiation sickness, burns, and increased cancer rates in the years that followed. Imagine being one of those villagers, told to leave everything behind without knowing why, watching soldiers in protective gear while you have none, wondering what invisible danger had invaded your land. The Soviet government kept the disaster secret for years, even from many of the people directly affected. It wasn't until the 1970s that details began to leak out, thanks to whistleblowers and scientists who risked punishment to tell the world what had happened. The Kyshtym Disaster is often overshadowed by Chernobyl, but it was a turning point in nuclear safety awareness. It showed just how dangerous nuclear waste can be if mishandled, and how secrecy can make a disaster even worse. Today, the site of the explosion is still one of the most contaminated places on Earth. The surrounding area has become an eerie, restricted zone, overgrown with forest, but too dangerous for permanent habitation. The Kyshtym Disaster is a reminder that some of humanity's most dangerous mistakes can stay hidden for years, and that the invisible legacy of radiation can last for generations after the glow fades from the sky.
Tunguska Event. The morning of June 30th, 1908 began like any other in the remote Siberian wilderness until the sky split open. A blinding flash lit up the horizon, followed by a shock wave so powerful it knocked people off their feet hundreds of kilometers away. In seconds, a patch of forest the size of a major city was flattened. This was the Tunguska Event, the largest impact event in recorded human history, even though the object never actually hit the ground. Scientists now believe it was caused by a comet or asteroid about 50-60 meters wide that exploded in the atmosphere, releasing the energy of a 10 to 15 megaton bomb. The explosion leveled over 2,000 square kilometers of forest, about the size of Tokyo, snapping trees like matchsticks and scorching their trunks. Eyewitnesses described a column of fire rising into the sky and a thunderclap so loud it was heard as far away as London's barometers. Luckily, Tunguska was uninhabited. Had the object exploded over a city, it could have killed hundreds of thousands instantly. Imagine a blast wave flattening every building for miles, windows shattering hundreds of kilometers away, and firestorms consuming what was left. At the time, news of the event was slow to spread. It took years before researchers could travel to the remote site, and when they did, they found a scene that looked like the aftermath of an apocalyptic war. Millions of trees all lying in the same direction, radiating outward from ground zero. The Tunguska event puzzled scientists for decades. No crater was ever found, leading some to speculate about everything from volcanic eruptions to alien spaceships. Only in the late 20th century did researchers confirm that it was an airburst, an object that exploded before impact, leaving no solid meteorite behind. For scientists today, Tunguska is both fascinating and terrifying. It's a reminder that Earth is constantly bombarded by space rocks, most of them small, some of them big enough to cause continent-wide devastation. Tunguska was a wake-up call that these events are not just prehistoric relics, they still happen. And we were just lucky this one didn't hit over a populated area. Modern astronomers now scan the skies for near-Earth objects, trying to spot potential Tunguska-sized threats early. But there are still blind spots. An asteroid of the same size could approach from the direction of the Sun and go undetected until it's too late. Tunguska was a warning shot, a preview of what nature is capable of. The forest eventually grew back, but the lesson remains. Sometimes the biggest threats don't come from Earth at all, but from space, and we may only get one chance to prepare.
The windows blew in first. A blinding flash lit up the Russian winter sky, and just over a minute later, a deafening shockwave raced across Chelyabinsk, shattering glass across the city and knocking people to the ground. It was February 15th, 2013, the day a space rock reminded us just how vulnerable we still are. The object was small by cosmic standards, about 20 meters across, but it was traveling at over 60,000 kilometers per hour when it entered Earth's atmosphere. The friction caused it to explode in mid-air with the force of roughly 30 Hiroshima bombs. For the people on the ground, it was pure chaos. Dash cams captured the moment daylight turned white-hot, casting sharp shadows on snow-covered streets. Then came the boom, so powerful it injured over 1,000 people, most from flying glass as windows blew apart in schools, offices, and homes. Luckily, no one was killed, but the damage was widespread. Thousands of buildings were damaged, and the city was left reeling. People poured into the streets, many thinking a bomb had gone off. In the age of smartphones, the event went viral within hours, with videos of the fireballs streaking across the sky, stunning viewers around the world. What makes the Chelyabinsk Meteor so unsettling is that no one saw it coming. Because it approached from the direction of the sun, it was effectively invisible to telescopes that scan for near-Earth objects. Humanity only found out about it when it was already exploding overhead. Scientists rushed to study the event, recovering thousands of fragments from the frozen Chebarkul Lake area. These meteorites gave researchers valuable insights into the composition of space rocks, but they also served as a wake-up call. If an object just twice that size exploded over a major city, the damage could be catastrophic. Buildings could collapse, fires could break out, and tens of thousands could be injured or worse. Tunguska showed us what a big airburst can do to a forest. Chelyabinsk showed us what even a smaller one can do to a city. Today, space agencies are investing in planetary defense, building better telescopes, testing asteroid deflection missions like NASA's DART project, and mapping as many near-Earth objects as possible. But there are still many we haven't found, and Chelyabinsk proved we might only get seconds of warning if one comes from the wrong angle. That February morning was a rare moment when millions of people around the world watched the same terrifying footage and realized just how fragile we are under the vast sky. The shock wave may have faded, but its lesson is clear. Earth's atmosphere isn't an impenetrable shield, and we're still just one space rock away from disaster.
Carrington Event. In September 1859, people around the world looked up and saw the night sky blazing with colors. Auroras danced not just near the poles, but as far south as the Caribbean. In some places, the lights were so bright you could read a newspaper at midnight. It was beautiful and terrifying. This was the Carrington Event, the most powerful solar storm in recorded history, and if it happened today, it could bring the modern world to its knees. The storm began when astronomer Richard Carrington noticed a sudden flash on the surface of the sun. What we now know was a massive solar flare. Hours later, a coronal mass ejection, or CME, slammed into Earth's magnetic field, releasing a torrent of charged particles that electrified the atmosphere. The results were immediate and dramatic. Telegraph systems, the high-tech communication networks of the day, went haywire. Sparks flew from telegraph lines. Some operators were shocked, and equipment caught fire. Incredibly, some telegraph systems continued to send messages even after being disconnected from their power sources, running purely on the energy from the geomagnetic storm. For people who didn't understand what was happening, it must have felt apocalyptic. Farmers woke up in the middle of the night thinking dawn had come. Travelers saw crimson skies and thought distant cities were on fire. Newspapers reported the phenomenon with a mix of wonder and unease. In 1859, the damage was limited mostly to telegraph networks. But if a Carrington-scale event struck today, the consequences would be vastly more severe. Modern civilization depends on electricity, satellites, and global communications. A powerful solar storm could fry power grids, knock out GPS systems, disable satellites, and disrupt internet infrastructure worldwide. Scientists estimate that it could take months, even years, to fully repair the damage from a modern Carrington event. Billions of dollars in economic losses would pile up each day. Imagine trying to live without electricity, without communications, without GPS, not just for a few hours, but for weeks on end. There have been near misses. In 2012, a CME almost as powerful as the Carrington event narrowly missed Earth's orbit. If it had hit us, we might have been plunged into a global blackout. Today, space agencies monitor the sun closely, giving us at least a little warning before a big solar storm arrives. Power companies have plans to shut down parts of the grid to protect them during major solar events. But there's still no guaranteed way to shield the entire planet from a storm of that size. The Carrington event is a reminder that the sun, the same star that gives us life, also has the power to disrupt our entire civilization. The next time the sky lights up in brilliant colors, we may want to hope it's just a pretty aurora and not the start of another cosmic blackout.
Near-miss asteroids. A hunk of rock the size of a skyscraper hurtled toward Earth at 30,000 kilometers per hour, and for a few tense days in 2004, scientists thought it might hit. That asteroid was Apophis, and it wasn't the only close call we've had. More than once, the planet has been just a cosmic blink away from disaster. When Apophis was first discovered in 2004, early calculations suggested it had a 1 in 37 chance of striking Earth in 2029, an alarming number when you're talking about a rock large enough to wipe out an entire region.
Astronomers around the world scrambled to refine the orbit, tracking it night after night. The more data they collected, the more the probability dropped, until the threat was ruled out, but only after months of anxiety. Even so, Apophis will still be a spectacularly close visitor. In 2029, it will pass closer than some satellites, visible to the naked eye as it streaks across the sky. If it were just slightly off its path, it could have been a civilization-level disaster. And Apophis isn't alone. In March 2004, an asteroid called 2004 FH passed just 42,600 kilometers from Earth, closer than geostationary satellites. It was only discovered 3 days before it whizzed by. Another asteroid, 2019 OK, surprised astronomers by flying by at about 1/5 the distance to the Moon. Had it hit, it would have released the energy of a nuclear bomb over a city. That's the unsettling part. Many of these objects aren't found until they're practically on top of us. Most are small enough to be missed by large surveys until days or hours before a close approach. And while small asteroids might only level a city, larger ones, like the one that killed the dinosaurs, are out there too. Imagine waking up to a news alert that an asteroid is going to pass within the orbit of the Moon tonight. There's nothing anyone can do except watch and hope. We don't have a fully operational planetary defense system yet, though projects like NASA's DART mission have successfully tested asteroid deflection technology. Near-miss asteroids are a reminder that Earth is part of a shooting gallery. Most of the time, the big rocks miss us. Sometimes they hit, like the Chelyabinsk Meteor in 2013. It's not a question of if another impact will happen, but when. Each time one of these space rocks sails past us, we get another chance to prepare. Because one day, the countdown might end differently, and we'll need to be ready. GRB Threats. 1 second, the night sky is calm. The next, a blinding flash from across the galaxy wipes out Earth's ozone layer and bathes the planet in deadly radiation. That's the terrifying scenario scientists warn about when they talk about gamma-ray bursts, GRBs, the most powerful explosions in the known universe. A gamma-ray burst is like a cosmic death ray. It happens when a massive star collapses into a black hole, or when two neutron stars collide. In that moment, a narrow jet of energy shoots out at nearly the speed of light, releasing more energy in a few seconds than our Sun will emit in its entire 10 billion-year lifetime. Most of these explosions happen far away, in distant galaxies, where they pose no threat to us. But every once in a while, scientists spot a GRB that's uncomfortably close by cosmic standards, and they can't help but wonder, what if one of those jets was aimed right at us? If a gamma-ray burst ever hit Earth head-on, we wouldn't see it coming. There would be no warning, no defense. The intense radiation would shred our ozone layer within seconds, leaving the surface exposed to lethal levels of ultraviolet light from the sun. The immediate effect wouldn't be a Hollywood-style explosion. It would be a slow-motion catastrophe. Crops would fail, Ecosystems would collapse, and mass extinctions could follow. Some scientists even think a gamma-ray burst may have caused one of Earth's past mass extinctions, hundreds of millions of years ago. The fossil record shows a sudden die-off of marine life that matches what we'd expect from a planet bathed in radiation. What makes GRBs so scary is that they're completely out of our control. We can't stop one, we can't predict one far in advance, and we can't shield the entire planet from its effects. All we can do is watch the sky and hope none of the stars pointing their deadly jets in our direction are close enough to matter. For perspective, even if one happened in our own Milky Way galaxy, it would need to be relatively near, within a few thousand light years, and aimed perfectly at Earth to do real damage. The odds are low, but not zero. And with trillions of stars out there, low odds still mean it will happen to someone, somewhere, eventually. Thinking about gamma-ray bursts is humbling. They remind us that even as we worry about wars, pandemics, and climate change, there are forces in the universe that could erase us without even noticing. If humanity ever does face a GRB, we may not have time to react. But for now, we can look up at the night sky and know that we're lucky. Every second that goes by without that fatal flash is another borrowed moment in the fragile story of life on Earth.